Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is lifted up in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 31, War Approaches, Baby Boom. A dead woman lay by the banks of a river. And over her, there stood a hollow. Approaching this scene, Kyojaku Kukaki glanced around uncertainly. Rain came pouring down, swelling the canal, although it didn't make a sound. All the same, no one else here moved. Whose dream was this? Nobody seemed familiar. Certainly not the hollow, a great green shaggy thing whose pelt was untouched by the rain. And the lady had fallen face down, so he couldn't see her face. Blood leaked out to stain the puddles beneath her. Uttering a loathsome chuckle, the hollow suddenly bent lower, the lure dangling from its mask retracting back into its fount. Watching, the dream mage couldn't help but shudder at what he knew must come next. He wanted to call out for help, stop this from happening somehow. Just as he thought this, a blue bolt of energy shot across the river, forcing the hollow to leap back with a snarl of thwarted rage. To Kyojaku's relief, an old man in a tattered robe followed. A blue bow made of spiritual energy held securely in one hand continued to train upon the beast. Gray-haired but steely-eyed behind his glasses, the archer walked across the river on thin air, his feet supported by discs that formed and disappeared at each step until he stood over the woman's body. "You have taken more than your fair share," he told the hollow. At this the creature uttered a deep, echoing chuckle. Despite being reassured at the Quincy's presence, Kyojaku couldn't help but shiver at this sound. "There is no such thing," it uttered in a voice like stone grinding together. "If I want something, I take it." Crouched on all fours, the hairy hollow sniffed the air like a dog, and then grinned, tongue lolling obscenely from its mouth. "And if more should come along to try and intervene, why, I'll eat them tea." Quick as a flash the old man fired. A volley of blue arrows soared through the air, but the hollow slid to one side, deftly sidestepping the attack. It then charged like an angry boar at its enemy, who turned adroitly to meet it, limber despite his age. The string was already drawn, there didn't seem any way he could miss at this range. Right then the lure on the hollow's huge head sprang out again. Something emerged from it that looked almost like a mannequin, or a doll. It had no features. But for some reason when he saw it, the Quincy froze. His face grew white with horror and disbelief. "Darling," he whispered. Whatever he had seen, Kyojaku clearly couldn't, no matter how hard he looked. But all too visible were the red claws that sprang from those stubby fingers intent on skewering the valiant old soul. "Look out!" The dream walker screamed in spite of himself, knowing all too well it made no difference. This was a memory dream. He couldn't influence the actions, only observe them. But to his relief, something did happen. Out of nowhere a figure he hadn't noticed till now sprang forward with a wild cry, swinging a curved spear as he did. His target was the hanging lure. However, perhaps owing to the fact that he had announced his presence, the hollow was able to jerk its head aside in time. Still the blow connected, and there came a pained roar. Kyojaku watched with renewed anxiety. The hollow had scrambled back to regard them with narrowed red eyes. The talons of its hand lay severed and bleeding on the ground. The person responsible for this rose up with a frown, draping his weapon over one black-robed shoulder. Kyojaku's heart soared as he recognized the uniform of a Shinigami, though somewhat antiquated, not sleek and modern like he was used to seeing. It looked more like the kind his father wore. Rubbing his bald head, the death god spat impolitely. "Pay. Damn, thought I had you for sure there. And you even tried sneaking up on him," a new voice sang. "Just like they taught us at the academy." They were then joined by another Shinigami who came sauntering over, although this one was so pretty he seemed weirdly out of place in this grim locale. He had an orange collar attached to his sleeve with tags, and there were actual feathers woven into his eyebrows. This new fighter strolled into the battlefield as though someone so outrageous belonged there by right, stopping a few yards away to regard them with a lazy smile and hand resting on his unsheathed blade. "Noble death gods," the elderly Quincy spoke up, executing a short bow while readying his weapon once more. Whatever spell had been cast on him appeared to no longer be active. "Paltry though my efforts may be, please allow me to assist you in disposing of this monster." At his speech both Shinigami shared a look. The pretty one chuckled and ran a hand through his silky black hair. "Ah, Pardon me, old-timer, but that's not how we do things in our division. Ganging up on an opponent, even one as utterly hideous as that. He flicked a glance at the crouching Hollow, wrinkling his nose as though detecting a foul odor in the air. Well, it's simply not beautiful, understand? The archer seemed taken aback. But surely together we... Hey, Gramps. The bald one growled, slapping the haft of his spear into his free hand with a sharp smack while never taking his eyes off the Hollow. You're in the way. We've been tracking this guy for a solid week. He's worth a buttload of cash, and I ain't gonna let that much bounty slip through my fingers now. Why here? Watching this altercation, Kyojaku couldn't help but wonder why they were arguing. Surely the old man had a point. The Hollow seemed wary at being confronted by 3 opponents, certainly not as confident as before. Its eyes drifted between them and the corpse of its latest victim as though debating whether it was worth the risk of staying to duke it out. Maybe that mesmerizing trick it used only worked on one person at a time? If they all fought together, it couldn't possibly. It seemed the beast had reached that conclusion too. With one final backward glance it turned and sped off. Hey! The bald Shinigami exclaimed indignantly. He's doing a scarper. Yumi Chika, move it. And he took off in pursuit. Already drawing a bead on the fleeing enemy, the Quincy reared back in surprise as a hand came down on his bow. MMM. The pretty spirit wagged a finger in condemnation. No interfering. This is his fight, understand? You can follow, and if we lose, then it's all yours. Until then, no fireworks. Purple eyes narrowed in what might have been an implicit threat. Got it. Blinking, the old archer let out his breath before allowing his bow to dissipate. Yes, honored Shinigami. I shall do as you instruct. Please excuse me now. So saying, he summoned his floating technique and soon sped across the sky fast as one of his arrows. Back at the site of the brief battle, only Kyojaku and the handsome death god remained. The latter rubbed a finger beneath his nose and sniffed before turning his attention to the dead woman. Crouching beside her, he examined the body for signs of life, and finding none, let out a heavy sigh. Such a waste, he murmured. At this point something occurred to Kyojaku. If the lady was already dead, where was her soul? Had the Hollow eaten it beforehand? But then, why did he stick around? It was only then did he notice the boy lying beneath her, half hidden by the corpse and covered in her blood. Even like this, there was no mistaking that orange hair. Suddenly Kyojaku knew whose dream this must be, and he felt deeply ashamed. Perhaps as a result of this, the imagery began to fade abruptly around him. Before it did, though, he saw the Shinigami reach a hand into his robe and emerge with a cell phone. Pressing some buttons, he brought it to one ear and waited patiently. Then his eyes brightened. Hello, Kuratsuka Fukutaiku? This is Yumi Chika Ayasukawa from the 11th. Regarding that deal we made, I just ran across what I think might be a Quincy, so if your putrid parent is still interested. Everything faded into whiteness, and Kyojaku came awake to feel himself being shaken. Shotoku! Wake up! He looked up to find his father kneeling anxiously beside his bed. Blinking, the teen sat up. At seeing this, Ichigo let out a shaky sigh and leaned back. Are you all right? He asked. Jaku nodded. I was dreaming. I know. But you were thrashing around and making these sounds, I thought. Ashen-faced, his distraught parent passed a hand over his eyes. Then he stood up. Sorry. I just worry. So saying, he left the room, looking back as the door closed behind him. Sweet dreams, okay, kiddo. Feeling more tired than before he actually went to bed, Kyojaku could only nod in response. He settled back down on his pillow, gazing up at the ceiling. For him to have seen that dream, should he feel bad? But there was no way to control it. Not yet, at least. Fortunately, the rest of the night held only peaceful rest for him. When Ichigo slipped carefully back under the covers, he heard Rukia ask, "Everything all right?" "I don't know." For a while he just stared at the ceiling, then turned to look at her. "Should we be doing more? I think it might be getting worse." Apparently she was only half awake. Isane says, "They're both fine." Nothing's wrong. And she yawned before flipping over to drape an arm across his chest comfortingly. Just go back to sleep. His fingers twined gently around hers in search of comfort. Rukia had never shared his concerns about these dream journeys their son took. They had spoken about it at length several times. But if he could only make her see. I know why we decided not to before, he spoke carefully, feeling his way across what he knew was dangerous ground. But do you think we should ask someone besides Isane to look at them? I can't believe I'm saying this, but Urahara might. No. Nothing sleepy about the way she said that. Still, he persevered. Not him specifically, and definitely not Kuratsuki. But what about Akon? He's always seemed reliable. Rukia pulled her hand free, flipping around to face the wall. I won't have anyone from the bureau examining our children. They didn't say anything more after that. There was no point. The matter seemed to be tabled for the time being. Ichigo could understand her resistance to the idea. Heaven knows the thought of Mayuri Kuratsuki or Kisuke Urahara taking an interest in his kids sounded like a nightmare on its face. But Kyojaku's escapades and dreams were only increasing. He seemed to spend as much time asleep as awake lately. The school had called more than once about him drifting off in class, sometimes so heavily even the teacher got worried. There had to be something they could do about this. This is my son we're talking about. He can't sleepwalk through his life. Not like me. And if Rukia doesn't understand how I feel, then I might have to do something about it on my own. Sand slid beneath her feet, nearly causing her to fall down a dune. But Hirako kept walking. The 11-year-old had no idea where she might be or how she had gotten here. Most likely this was a dream. No surprise there. Only now, she had something to go on. A small orange glow in the distance indicated a fire, and that could mean people. As it turned out, she was right. The story of how we first met. So anyway, there I was. A loud, happy voice accompanied by laughter carried to her on the wind. Her short legs quickened their pace. Surrounded by a dozen mean bastards. You said it was only 4. 4, a dozen, what's the difference? Ignoring a muttered comment of 8, the speaker resumed his tale with gusto. My back to the wall, the stolen gold tucked under my arm, I was prepared to lay them all low, when suddenly someone said, mind if I join in? In a short time, Hirako could make out a bonfire with what looked to be 3 people around it. 2 of them were normal enough. They wore the reassuring attire of Shinigami, something she knew well by now. The third, however, made her leery about approaching. He was a giant, absolutely enormous. Despite this, the huge fellow let out great booms of cheerful mirth that made her think he must be friendly. I turned around. Leaping up, the bald fellow then demonstrated. And there he stood. Unarmed, smiling at me, smelling like a bordello, with feathers in his hair. At first, I thought he was a woman. But then I caught the look in his eye, and I knew. The giant noticed her at the same time as the storyteller. He bent down and whispered in a rumble to his compatriots, and they all watched as she approached. Trying to appear confident, Hirako came over and sat on what looked to be a petrified log of some kind. She held out her hands to the fire, glad for the warmth it offered. Further apart, the 3 Shinigami appeared mystified by her appearance. They glanced at one another and shrugged. Finally the smallest of them, a lank-haired little fellow with big eyes, leaned over to catch her attention. Hello, little one, he said kindly. What are you doing here? She shrugged. I don't know. At this the bald hatchet-faced man snorted and threw back a jug of liquor. Wiping his mouth with a laugh, he nudged the giant's leg with his elbow. What do ya think, Jidanbo? She's some kinda hollow bait, sent to lure us in. The great muscle-bound fellow reached down and idly flicked his comrade in the head, earning him an angry glare. Out loud he said, our guest is a human, Ikeku. Nothing more. Oh. Ikeku seemed to muse on this, then grinned like a shark. Oi, kid. He called, and when she looked at him, he held out the gourd. You want a drink? No, she does not. The small death god yelped, leaping up and snatching the offered alcohol. He took a belt himself, shivered with a gasp, then turned back to Hirako wearing a friendly smile. You don't have to worry. You're safe now. We're. And he indicated around the campfire, Shinigami. We'll protect you. That was reassuring. Okay, she said. Back to the story. Ikeka resumed his tale, indicating for Hirako to join in, which she did. I could tell his blood was up, just like mine. I'd never seen anyone so excited to get in on a fight before. And without a second thought I answered, hell yeah, man. And if we win, I'll split this here gold with you on drinks. And he looks at me and says, well, aren't you beautiful, dot. Wearing a satisfied and somewhat crazed grin, he flopped back down. And then we beat all their asses. Now in better company and no longer quite as cold, Hirako decided this must be one of her weird dreams. They happened sometimes. She was never quite sure where she'd end up. Her brother Kyojaku said in times like this, she should try to find out as much as possible, so the lost child plucked up her courage and asked, what are you doing here? It's an anniversary, the short one explained. We are celebrating the date of a friend's death, Jidanbo added with a reflective rumble. He then raised his kiddie pool-sized dish, and the other two did the same. They quaffed their liquor, letting out great bellows of satisfaction afterwards, which made Hirako laugh. At this Ikeku again offered her a drink, which caused his tiny partner to scold him severely. Ah, lighten up, Hanataro. Ikeku reclined on one side, scratching his stomach. He then brightened as an idea seemed to occur to him. Oi, sweetheart. He called out to Hirako merrily. How's about you pour us three handsome warriors our drinks, eh? A brilliant idea. Jidanbo boomed. Sake tastes better when a lovely lady serves it. He smiled warmly at her, his cheeks bright red and face practically glowing with good cheer. Lovely. The compliment pleased Hirako. She always felt her hair was a mess and her eyes were too big. Indeed. You are a beauty, to be sure. And we can tell her stories as payment, his bald friend added when Hanataro seemed about to pipe up in protest. Nothing wrong with that, right? After further discussion, they finally agreed that this was all right. Feeling proud to be included, Hirako happily did as they bid, sharing out drinks from ceramic flasks into their dishes and obediently following Ikeku's instructions about how to pour and bow afterwards. Jidanbo's cup was too big to fill, but he had a large barrel nearby from which he dipped a ladle, and he permitted her to add a small amount, chuckling good-naturedly at how earnestly she concentrated so as not to spill a drop. And when no one was looking, Hirako would sneak herself a tiny sip. It made her cough, but she liked how warm the liquor made her head feel. Let's see now, what next? Rubbing his chin in reflection, Ikeku then slapped his shin violently. So there's this Shinigami fellow, right? We're kicking his ass, when all of a sudden, he uses Shunpo to get behind us. Must have been the first one we ever met, 'cause I remember being really surprised at how fast he moved. But then, he's got behind us, and we're totally exposed. You know what he does then? He starts boasting. Hanataro shook his head, chuckling. Yes. He's all like, such a pity you country bumpkins. Something or other. But before he can finish, wham. Without turning around, Yumi elbows him right in the face. Here Ikeku demonstrated, coming back to his audience wearing a tooth-blazing grin. The guy goes staggering back, and he straightens up and then, and I'm not making this up, he looks at us and goes. He adopted a solemn expression, lifting his chin to sniff haughtily. I suppose no one ever told you louts, swords, they're stronger when you use two hands. And then a bout of drunken giggling came over him, and with an effort he managed to gasp out, takes, one hand, his free hand. Ikeku lifted his left hand and waggled it demonstratively. And he, slowly, like he's thinking real hard about what he's doing, he takes it, and he puts it, over the hand that's holding his sword. And the two of us look at each other, and we just crack up. At this he started laughing so hard there was no choice but to join in. Another gulp of booze found its way down Hirako's throat during the distraction, and soon enough she couldn't help but laugh as well. Finally Ikeku caught his breath enough to continue. Because seriously, have you ever heard anything so dumb? Like he thought he was revealing the secrets of the universe to us. And I'm like, oh, no. Not the mythical two-handed sword style. And Yumi's like, that technique has been forbidden for centuries. But now he's unsealed it. How will we survive? And we're howling fit to burst. He winked at Hirako, who had sat down and now listened with a rapt look on her face. She smiled back in a way that made him feel pleased with himself. Long story short, we bent him over backwards and shoved his head up his ass so's he could sniff his own farts easier. Language, please, Hanataro warned. Taking a sip of alcohol, he gazed up at the starless sky, where a great gibbous moon hung. You know, come to think of it, he was the only officer from the 11th that I never saw in the healing huts. Well, except for that business with Rukia-chan's execution, and that had more to do with his appearance. The firework Ganju hit him with didn't do much damage, but it messed up his hair, and he declared that he couldn't allow any of the lower-seated officers in his division to see him in such a condition. I remember that, his bald comrade laughed. He looked ridiculous. I popped my sticks laughing. And even then, he absolutely refused to let any of us touch him, or perform healing of any kind. With a sad shake of his head, little Hanataro returned his attention to the fire. The 11th were always such a handful for us to deal with. But where would we be without each other? Here Jidanbo stirred, his pronounced features growing contemplative. That bond will soon be reaffirmed before long, if Captain Zaraki's assessment is correct. No doubt. Lifting his head, Ikeku sniffed as though scenting something on the wind. War's on the way. It won't be long now. We'll get the go-ahead before too soon, and then it'll be a full-scale assault on the dead zone. I wish I could be there. Ha ha. All three Shinigami turned in surprise toward the little girl sitting on a log. She looked from one to another with a great big smile on her face. Cheeks flushed, weaving back and forth slightly as though unable to find her balance, she suddenly fell to her knees, the empty sake flask rolling across the sand. Little miss, here, let me take that from you, Hanataro spoke solicitously. He reached for the flask, and Hirako yanked it back, then proceeded to lead him on a merry chase around the fire, darting nimbly if somewhat drunkenly out of reach. The other two roared at this spectacle and egged them on, causing the spindly medic to fume in exasperation. At last he managed to catch her by the wrist. All right, now just. As he did, the girl twisted suddenly, pushing back against him to knock him off balance, while at the same time grabbing his hand. She then yanked hard, sending the shocked Shinigami flipping over her shoulder to land flat on his back where he lay blinking up at the sky. Ikeku's eyebrows rose. Beautiful move, sweetheart, he complimented her. At this she spun around to face him and proceeded to lose her balance, sprawling beside Hanataro. Hesitating, as though uncertain how her own body worked, the girl began to crawl carefully forward until she reached the wiry fighter, who watched her in bemusement. Before he could even frame a question, tiny arms wrapped around his neck, and a big wet kiss was planted firmly on his hairless head. Love you, ya big bald lunk. She crowed happily. Ikeku felt somewhat embarrassed at this display of affection, and managed to extricate himself from her grasp. Their little charge took no offense, merely laughed and curled up by the fire. At a gesture from Hanataro, Ikeku consented to drape the robe he had on over her to keep the kid warm. They then spent several minutes discussing what to do about this odd little fugitive. Hey, Jidanbo pointed out. She's disappearing. Sure enough, when they looked over, Hirako's body had started to fade. Moments later the straw blanket had settled gently on the ground. The three heavenly warriors could only puzzle over this occurrence. Eventually, though, they decided no harm had come of it, and presently returned to the reason for their being together. The drunken frivolities lasted long into the night, and by the time they disbanded to make their way home, all had forgotten about the mysterious visitor. Poor Tissan. He sat alone in the dark. And yet, at the same time, poor blind Tissan. Kaname Tissan was never truly alone. Chest bare, wearing only a set of silk trousers, the warlord of Nirvana maintained a rigid posture even while seated cross-legged on the floor of his chambers. He breathed in, savoring the feel of air entering his body, rich as always with potent spirit particles. It practically caressed him with every movement. Being blind, Tison had always been sensitive to his environment in a way he suspected those encumbered with sight were not. Sometimes he wondered if even Lord Eisen himself could appreciate the world they inhabited to the same degree as himself. Poor blind Tison. Can't see a thing, and tells himself he's superior for it. Poor Tison. The morning sun had just peeked over the mountains to bathe their world in golden warmth. He could tell by the subtle rise in temperature throughout this section of the palace. Having finished his meditations, Kanaim Tison rose and dressed himself. None of the servants were permitted to aid him in this task, or even enter his rooms. He had no wish to become soft. And for a true samurai, luxuries were kept to a minimum. Poor Tison. Nothing to do, so he goes for a walk. Can't see a thing. Suzumushi slipped into the belt to hang securely at his waist. Now suitably attired, he headed out into the corridor. But I can. It had been over a decade now since he became a Vazard at Lord Eisen's command. From that day, Tison was forced to deal with the mockery of his inner hollow. It whispered to him from one moment to the next, probing incessantly at what it considered to be his weaknesses, seeking to undermine his determination and break his confidence in himself and those he served. But Tison remained resolute. Poor Tison. Can't see the looks they give him. Doesn't know how much they hate him. As he strode along, passing servants quickly moved out of the way and bowed humbly. Kanaim did not speak to them. There was no need. He was a true Shinigami, a loyal retainer in service to the Lord of all realms. And he made sure to impress this upon those who did not follow his example. Poor Tison. Poor blind Tison. Eventually he found his way to the courtyard. A platoon of guards waited there for him, formed into neat orderly rows. None spoke at his approach. No show of inspection was made. Instead their leader strode past them. "Come," was all he said. And they obeyed. The patrol was conducted in impeccable fashion. They moved swiftly to investigate a potential rebel hideout that a captured soldier had insisted under torture could be found here. Even as they approached, however, Tison could already tell they would find nothing. And sure enough, the area proved deserted. His squad mingled about the lush tropical arbor, watched by innocent local wildlife who had no idea of the peril represented by armed men. Kanaim himself remained in the center of what might have been a small campsite at some point in the past. He could detect traces of a fire pit and the telltale signs of human activity. But nothing indicated any recent activity. They had been lied to. Again. Poor Tison. If only he could have seen the man's naked face, he would have known sooner. But he had known. This was not the first time a captured rebel had endured unspeakable agony only to continuously offer resistance. Such a show of devotion might have been admirable were it not in service to a doomed cause. The remnants of Zero Squad, those who had not seen fit to bend the knee to their true lord, remained at large in Nirvana. Lord Eisen had tasked Kanaim with rooting them out and ending their token rebellion. It was a mark of trust his master placed in him that he did not allow any of the other captains to accompany these pursuits, so that none might question his authority out in the field. In this way, he kept Nirvana safe, just as he had the outer limits of the Rokanga back when he commanded the 9th Division in Soul Society. Poor Tison. Poor blind Tison, relegated to a meaningless task just to get him out of the way, so they don't have to look at him moping about. Of course, the Lord of Heaven could have easily pinpointed those ragtag survivors and eradicated them in an instant. But such a thing was beneath the will of God. And so he entrusted this task to his most stalwart samurai, a man whom he knew was beyond reproach and could be trusted with such an important activity. Out of sight, out of mind. Poor blind Tison. Tison did not deign to use his hollow helm on this outing. It would be foolish to rely on that dangerous power overmuch. Such terrible force should be reserved for when it made the most sense to use it. Always reserved, always carefully contained. He held himself to the highest standards. Poor blind Tison. When Kanaim had concluded there was nothing to be found here, he ordered a return to base. The soldiers obeyed without hesitation. They respected his decision. There was no point wasting time, after all. The journey was made in silence, with none of the mindless chattering and pointless argument that marked less disciplined bands. One need only remember the example put on by the Kenpei, that egregious ogre, and his own slovenly uncouth subordinates. They caused rampant devastation to the Rukonga and its inhabitants on a regular basis, and yet the other captains and Central 46 never took Zaraki to task for it. Oh, they handed out a few warnings and light punishments here and there, but for the most part, nothing. It was believed that as long as the 11th won battles, they should be granted some leeway in terms of behavior pertaining to less martial pursuits. How many crimes were overlooked for the sake of appeasing those odious barbarians? How many tears were shed by the innocent victims they took advantage of and left carelessly in the dust, bitter and frustrated at having no recourse to gain justice. Such crimes would never be overlooked under Lord Aizen's rule. The wicked had no shield to hide behind mighty enough to withstand the power of the Almighty. Those who abided by the law were not only allowed to live in peace, but given prosperity. And those who flaunted it, believing themselves deserving of leniency and special treatment for whatever piddling reasons they might imagine, were dealt with openly and assuredly. Justice was served, sometimes at the end of a blade. He had carried out his duties secure in the knowledge that any bloodshed was done swiftly, mercifully, and without malice. Tison dispensed capital punishment only at the bidding of the one true ruler of heaven. Poor Tison! Reduced to a feeble copy of Yamamoto, blindly serving his king. A light meal had been set out for him upon his return, which he ate on a veranda overlooking the training grounds. Drills were conducted, both of swordsmanship and Kido, all of which he took pains to oversee. There would be no chance of lackadaisical sloth and indolence to enter their ranks. Lectures on various topics were scheduled for later, as well as suitable entertainment of a less serious bent. It was important to give the men some time to relax and taste the bounties of serving their king, after all. The rest of his day was spent in meditation. There were no meetings that needed his attention, otherwise he would have surely been informed. When twilight settled, and the chill of the evening sank into his skin, Tison permitted himself a small comfort. Secluded in his private residence, he poured out a small measure of wine before bed and sat nursing his cup. This much he would allow. Tison knew the perils of drink, and would not fall for any unsubtle snares less secure individuals allowed themselves to walk into heedlessly. He knew himself. He was resolute, firm, and held no doubts about the choices he made. Poor Tison! All alone, too frightened to reach out for company. Kaname was no fool. He knew that he could not fully trust himself, not anymore. A part of his soul lived only for its own ends, without regard for decency, morality, or humanity. But he would never succumb to his dark side. It would remain locked away till the day he died. Unwilling to let another into his chambers, his bed, for fear that they might slit his throat in the night. Satisfied, he took a small sip of the former King of Soul Society's private stock. The taste coursed all the way down his throat, and his milky eyes closed in reflexive bliss as this most ancient balm served to draw away the shroud that had settled over his thoughts. Can't even bring himself to admit he wants a woman. Tison sighed, letting himself relax for the first time all day. And the only one he did. A small sound almost like a sob escaped his throat. Never asked what she thought of him. Never even saw her face. Never knew what she looked like. But I did. Shut up. The cup shattered against the wall. How much she would have thanked you, had you only been brave enough to try. Long black braids rustled as his shoulders slumped. A sob racked his frame, followed swiftly by another. And like so many times before, Kaname Tison slumped to the floor and wept, bitterly grinding his teeth and striking his skull with sharp force, unmindful of the pain it caused. There could be no worse agony than what he kept inside his head, inside his heart. Is this what I survived for? Is this the purpose I was born to fulfill? If so, then why am I still afraid? Poor blind Tison. Akon-san. Of all the people Renji Aburai might have expected to meet here, the dour-faced chief technician of Ibis Squad would never have even made the list. For his part, Akon seemed in no way surprised to find the co-captain of Siamese Company accosting him. Coming down the path from the main house, he simply nodded his head in greeting. Captain Aburai. Why is he here? Why are you here? It felt a little rude to ask, really, but something about this encounter made Renji's skin prickle with apprehension. Komamura asked me to visit. Akon made this sound so natural, as if the longtime member of the Shinigami Research and Development Bureau showing up like a doctor making a house call was just an everyday occurrence. He certainly didn't look troubled about being accosted by the superior officer. Eventually Renji arrived at the conclusion that whatever this might involve, it didn't include him. So instead he gave an absent salute and went marching by. "Excuse me." "Certainly." The captain strode past, and the horned scientist turned to watch him go. As usual, his face remained unreadable, but inwardly Akon debated whether or not he should ask. In the end, he deemed it inappropriate on a professional level. And with that he headed back home. Renji followed a cobblestone path until he reached the main manor. While minuscule in comparison to the likes of the main Kukaki residence, the retirement villa belonging to Seijin Komamura still seemed palatial to his eye. He had a vague impression of owning some sort of domicile in the new heavenly domains as a result of being a captain. First seats were no longer required to remain in office until they died, after all, but the former slum rat had never bothered to visit his purported property or given much thought to it at all. Now, though, he found himself wondering somewhat sourly if Komamura had gotten a leg up on him in that respect as well. "Oh, listen to you, bemoaning your poor lot in life. Can't you feel happy for the big furry fellow? Had you not driven the lovely lady into his arms, he might never have gotten laid." "Thank you, imaginary Ayasukawa. My pleasure." Were it not just a figment of his imagination, Renji would have strangled the annoying hallucination a long time ago. Fortunately he had long experience with multiple voices competing for his attention. No more stalling. Time to get in there and do this, brother. His Zanpakuto had the right of it. He had put it off long enough. And with that settled, Abarai reached up and rang the entranceway bell. After about a minute, the door opened, and he found himself staring at a huge furry chest. "Not quite the décolletage you were hoping for, Renji." "Shut up." His gaze lifted higher, to meet the gleaming yellow eye of Seijin Komamura, the house's owner. The former captain regarded his erstwhile successor with an inscrutable expression. "Ah, Teiku," Seijin spoke before Renji could get a word out. He seemed neither confused nor surprised to find him here. "Won't you come in?" The giant stood aside and beckoned for him to enter. "Yeah, sure." It was rather irritating to find Komamura so genteel about all this. He behaved as if he didn't have a care in the world. All well and good for him. Not like he had much to worry about these days. Meanwhile, Renji remained quite confounded both professionally and emotionally. Years ago he had set a goal for himself as a way to settle once and for all the issues that had cropped up in his life. And very soon that goal might just be achieved. But even so, the fact remained he had a lot to work out in respect to certain people. And it was best to get started with the one who was most in contact with him these days. After all, they were in charge of the same division. The door shut behind him. A brief glance around confirmed the manor's tasteful exterior was replicated on the inside, being rather tidy and classy. Coming about, Renji and Komamura faced one another. Neither spoke. At last Seijin said, "Nell is waiting in the garden. Feel free to go on ahead." And he went shambling off down a corridor. "Thanks," Renji grumbled at his retreating back. Feeling somewhat insecure, he then followed the unmistakable aura of Arrancar down twisting unfamiliar lanes until he found himself in a small enclosed garden. There sat his co-captain, Nilil Tuadolshvank. The gorgeous Hollow had on a light yutaka as she reclined on a bench, dipping the fingers of one hand into an ornamental koi pond right beside her. As Renji watched, appreciating the sight of her bare legs put on display in this position, Nell suddenly snatched up a fish and popped it into her mouth, swallowing reflectively. "Charming. Shut it. You know what she's like." It was time to get down to business. Crossing the garden, Renji coughed to get her attention. "Hey, Nilil. I mean, Lieutenant Adolshvank. Great. Already screwing it up. You are not here on official business. Why not? Try to loosen up a little? Good idea. So listen, Nell, I was thinking. I'm pregnant." "Huh, that's weird. Could have sworn she just said she was pregnant." His Zanpakuto made absolutely no response. "Guys? What's up? You're acting weird. Like she said she was pregnant or something. Renji. What? Get your head out of your ass, and listen. Renji stood staring straight ahead without saying a word. Observing this reaction, or lack thereof, Nell sat up and crossed her arms. Well, it's no big deal, really. Akon just got back with some test results I asked him to run. He agreed that it's impossible for a hollow to have children under normal circumstances. Still staring, Renji felt his throat tighten. And that's all there is to it, really. The whole thing's impossible. Turning her head suddenly, Nell vomited the fish back out into the pond. It frantically swam as far away from her as it could and hid under a lily pad. She passed the back of one hand across her mouth with a grimace of frustration. Only I'm nauseous. And I want to eat strange things all the time. Like ice cream. And pickled vegetables. After what seemed like a very long time, Renji finally managed to suck in the tiniest amount of air, enough to ask. How? I think it's something Aizen might have done to me. Remember when I told you that it seemed like my hollow hole was getting smaller? Casually, like this whole conversation was no big deal, Nell opened her mouth and pointed to the back of her throat. Just guessing, but I think when Aizen learned Ichimaru and I were sleeping together. Huh. He secretly did something to me, as one of his experiments. He was always crazy about fiddling with hollows, seeing if there were ways to improve them, that sort of thing. Usually without their consent. Why? But back to the main topic. The Aaron car stood up and began walking out of the garden. Renji mindlessly turned to follow. Both Shinigami and hollows can take on each other's traits, so the prospect of a true hybrid from birth isn't that far-fetched. We're all fundamentally the same, deep down. And most of the Shinigami I've slept with had a taint of hollow in them. Ichimaru, Komamura, you. Who? I always meant to ask you about that. Maybe later. When they reached the kitchen, Saijin had already prepared a scrumptious repast and now busied himself laying out dishes. Nell took her seat at the table and began to tuck in. Between mouthfuls of rather ordinary fare by her standards, she continued. So I'm thinking eventually all that influx built up over time, resulting in me becoming pregnant. I'm not sure if this means you're all the father, or only one. It might even be Nanao. Or Hitsugaya. What? This came from both Renji and Saijin. The dog man almost dropped a plate of sizzling sausages. Meanwhile, Captain Aburai's brain was still running on fumes. After taking a sip of tea, Neelil cast tranquil eyes at them both. So we're going to have to sit down and figure this out. Probably after the current operation in Hueco Mundo is complete. I'd appreciate both of your support. Because frankly, I'm at a loss. And she began to wolf down some pancakes. Renji blinked several times very rapidly, and finally said, I'm going to throw up. Which he promptly did. Fortunately, Saijin had placed several buckets around the house for Nell's convenience, so there was little mess. Tatsuki Arisawa could count the number of times she had been in the Kunieda home on one hand. Ryo could hardly be called open and engaging at the best of times. Even after joining the same underground cabal, they hadn't seen fit to socialize after hours much. That bit of subterfuge evidently hadn't come as much of a game-changer to Ryo as the others. After all, she had a lifetime's worth of experience being involved in illicit undertakings. Nobody had never actually come out and said it. But it seemed pretty clear that the Kunieda were Yakuza. Right here in Karakura town. Who'd have thought? So how's married life treating you? We're happy. Kneeling on the floor wearing a white kimono, Ryo slowly and carefully drew a katana along a whetstone. Schwick. The sound it made reminded Tatsuki of sharpening knives in the kitchen. Kind of relaxing, really. I see you dyed your hair again. Yeah. She scratched her scalp self-consciously. The red dye still felt itchy, but that would go away in time. A flicker out of the corner of one eye got her back on track. Ichimaru says they'll be making their move within a year. I see. Schwick. Kunieda kept her attention bent on the task before her. Then, just when Tatsuki thought she had nothing more to say, the gang mistress added, Has he told you what he expects from you? No. Curiosity compelled her to ask. You? No. Schwick. But I can guess. That got Tatsuki's attention. It caused her no shame to admit that Ryo was the most intelligent out of the 4 living actors Ichimaru and Matsumoto had tempted over to their side. Even back in high school, she was at the top of their class. And while not everybody knew this, she had graduated from Tokyo University with honors, earning a doctorate in anthropology of all things while outperforming challengers on the racetrack. Ryo refused offers to compete professionally, whether in the Olympics or otherwise. But it was this shared appreciation for athletics that had kept Tatsuki closer to her than any of their other friends since graduating high school. The Olympic champion glanced around the spacious room of the manor she found herself in. Antique wall scrolls on display, Japanese cypress flooring under the tatami mats, and the sliding screens held the work of masters in the Kano style, blending breathtaking paint with shimmering gold leaf. This whole complex was like something straight out of the shogunate plopped right in a residential district of town, and nobody saw fit to comment. So it came as no surprise that Ryo held an interest in cultural history. By the look of it, her family had been quietly living in this region since the Tokugawa era. While Tatsuki considered this, the young mistress of this house explained. I believe Ichimaru selected me because he wanted to find out how effective my intimidation was, and its limits. Roping in Kon got him you, as well as a potential informant on the doings in the Kurosaki household. He's never spied on them, Tatsuki interjected bluntly. Of course. Here Ryo held the blade up before her eyes, examining their reflection in the length of folded steel. She didn't seem to care about the issue one way or another. Then there's Tezuma, who can be considered an informant and double agent for the hollow side. Thanks to her we know about Rose, and Grimjo. Picking up the black lacquer scabbard, she carefully slid the katana back inside. Schwick. I believe we are Ichimaru's contingency plan should Soul Society fail to handle the hollows. Grimjo aims to become a Vastolord. If that happens, it's possible not even the entire Godi I-7 will be able to stop him. She then turned her head to regard her house guest leaning against a wall. Those cool black eyes made Tatsuki shiver involuntarily, which caused the martial artist to feel restless. So where do I fit in? Am I just the muscle who can potentially kill those two? No. If Jin wanted them dead, I think he'd have already done it by now. He seems to have ways of getting around and following people that nobody is able to catch onto. Believe me, I've tried. A faint hint of annoyance crept into her words at that, which actually served to give Tatsuki a sense of relief. Nice to know she wasn't the only one who had never stopped mistrusting the 2 renegade Shinigami. All the same, it was even more disturbing to learn that even with all of Kuniada's acumen and resources, the Kitsune had managed to elude her. Ryo continued. I think he wants them to succeed in their respective endeavors. That's where we come in. My power can get us close to Grimjo without him noticing. Right in his face, if need be. And once we're that close, you can do the same thing to him that you did to Ulquiorra. After that, you'll be strong enough to challenge anyone. Even Aizen. As she spoke, Tatsuki's shadow on the wall writhed. It slid to one side, becoming an image of a man with horns and wings. This demonic figure then stepped off the canvas to join them as the midnight silhouette of Ulquiorra Schiffer. I will not share space with Grimjo. Relax. You'll always be my favorite roommate. The incorporeal fiend turned to glower at her, but she let it slide. Tatsuki was more intrigued with what her friend had suggested. So you think he wants me to absorb Grimjo? Yes. Here Kuniada's face became thoughtful. I must say, you two seem to be getting along better than ever. If I may ask, what finally changed things? We had a heart-to-heart. You'll never get anywhere just keeping to yourself, you know. Your opinions hold no relevance for me. Okay, how about this, tell me a story. I am not here to alleviate your boredom. I'm serious. If you don't want to talk about what happened, if it's too much to handle right now. I do not. Then start small. I'm willing to help. Tell me your goals. What do you hope for in your future? Where did you come from? You keep reminding me you're not human. Maybe that's the problem, but also the answer. You remember things about yourself a living person can't. What's the first thing that ever happened in your life? I am not alive. Don't dodge the question. You know what I mean. What's to lose by revealing something that tiny? Blood. Oh, seriously? Is that all? Like birth blood, or something? It was not from birth. The blood came from death. Okay, now that's how you start a good story. Go on. Perhaps he secretly appreciated her praise, for he consented. Humans were sacrificed, throats cut, and hearts removed from their bodies. An offering to their God. To me. With everyone, I took strength and form. Yet I was imprisoned. I could not leave. Despite this, I saw all around me. The passing of time, movement of sun, moon, and stars. Oftentimes it felt as though I were in two places at once. There was no way to interact, to move, or speak. I had no purpose I could divine, nor any way to achieve it. As if I did not truly exist at all. Nothing about my existence made any sort of sense. And this continued for centuries. That would have driven me crazy too. I seek no sympathy. And do not interrupt. My bad. Go on. The world was open to my sight. Countless humans lived their lives and died under my gaze, preyed upon by hollows in each other, with death gods shepherding the souls of the departed. Battles were fought, and even greater sacrifices made in my name. Prisoners of war, conquered peoples, a veritable feast. No Shinigami for them. They were mine. Yet as I continued to grow, so did my emptiness, and the certainty that this could not last. No matter how many sacrifices I received now, I was dying. Without anyone even knowing I had existed, or told me why. A god of nothing, perishing alone and unheard. The contradiction was tearing me apart, until my presence at last held impact, and the very planet itself cried out in horror. Storms gathered. The earth trembled. Fear gripped the land. Then the death gods came in full. Shinigami. A mighty host of them. Were you scared? I did not care. My turmoil was all that mattered. It had consumed me down to almost nothing. It held me in place. I was erupting from being unable to leave. All I could think of was death. One more death. Just one more human sacrifice, to keep me going for a little longer. If I could only hold out a bit more, then I might find the answer. I might know why. But there was no death. No blood to sustain me. I had reached the point of no return. Until I realized. I could offer myself. What? My death. My heart and blood. To feed the need within me. I could kill myself. The last sacrifice. So I did. And in that instant, when I tasted my own death, even as it left me, I realized I had a soul. Soul, huh? After that I took everything the world around me had to offer. Humans, death gods, hollows, my death pulled them all in at once. A hurricane of souls. Their flesh became my flesh, a vessel for me to inhabit. The moment passed, and I existed, though nothing of the old me remained. I lifted my head, raised my arms to the full moon high above, and for the first time, I was free. The tale had ended. Hey. You know something? You're good at telling stories. He stared at her. Feel any better? No. You really mean that, don't you? Yes. Dead from death, talk about X-Files. What? It was this sci-fi American show. Ichigo's kid sister Yuzo got hooked on it, made me watch a few episodes. Anyway, they had all kinds of weird shit, and in one there were a bunch of vampires who could only be killed by other vampires. But in order to become a vampire, you had to kill a person, and this one lady, she decided to kill herself to become a vampire and kill the other vampires at the same time. And apparently that worked. Because they all died. Silence followed. You are a terrible storyteller. Thanks. The power of death. Kunia Dario mused to herself. Is that what you call your ability? Universal death. I don't call it anything. Walking past her in Ulquira, Tatsuki studied a screen painting showing an emperor holding court in his garden, with tame beasts and retainers gathered all around. It got her thinking. I used to think we were a menagerie, she spoke softly. A troop of beasts that Ichimaru put together to protect himself in case trouble came knocking. But if you're right, then, he plans to use us when the war starts. She turned back to look at them both, the human in white, Hollow in black. We just might be the heroes in this story, guys. Kunieda flicked open a fan and held it before her face, one eyebrow lifting over her wintry gaze. Superb. I would rather be dead. Ulquiorra made his own enthusiasm abundantly clear. Yet in spite of this, Tatsuki Arisawa couldn't help but smile. For some reason, she was actually feeling hopeful again. Dyed red hair slipped out of the corner of one eye, making her shiver. Kneeling before a gravestone, Soifone did not move a muscle when she said, "How may I be of service, Noboru-sama?" Busted. Oh, like it's that big of a surprise. From the boughs of a great cherry blossom tree spreading its pink foliage wide over the cemetery, a small black and white capuchin monkey came scampering down and gamboled over to join the Viper Company captain. Moments later it had transformed into a brown-skinned youth tugging on a special forces uniform before kneeling at his captain's side. For a while nothing more was said between them. The ninja woman kept her eyes closed with hands clasped. Sticks of incense burned before the tombstone, a simple white slab virtually identical to its neighbors, stretching out in countless lines across numerous levels of this place. The graveyard of the Godei 13 held very few standouts, a particularly powerful lieutenant, or some hero who gave her life for the sake of a superior officer. Few others warranted fanfare. The one they currently sat before was no exception. Noboru Shihoin read the name on the slab. Who was he? An old boyfriend? He asked with all due nonchalance. No, his retainer said in a way that sounded oddly kind. It made him squirm to hear it. This man killed the fiend that murdered my brothers and grandmother. He died doing so. Oh. Noboru read the name again. It sounded familiar, but he couldn't bother to think about that now. Inwardly the prince cursed himself for that boyfriend comment. Feng wasn't stupid. In the hopes of staving her off from drawing any conclusions, he instead said, "It's nice of you to still come out here and look after his grave. I do what I can. For him, and the family he left behind." Before he could follow up on that, she struck fast and hard. "Why are you here? The campaign will begin soon. Do you wish to review your orders prior to departure?" "No. Smooth dialogue, partner. I know, okay? Don't distract me. I'm nervous enough about this as it is." "Okay, kid. You're on your own." Deciding to emulate Feng's blunt mode of conversation, the Shihoin heir screwed up his courage. "Feng, how would you like to go on a date with me?" At first it didn't appear as if she had heard him. Then just as he was considering repeating himself for good measure, she abruptly swiveled around to face him. Those cold black eyes had narrowed to an even greater degree than usual. Was she thinking about killing him? Wouldn't be the first time. At last Soifone spoke. "I am yours to command, Noboru-sama." That hurt. Worse than if she had just said no, but oddly enough, it didn't cause him to lose hope. Because he had imagined several scenarios about how this might play out. And while some of them were admittedly fantastical, Noboru understood that the most likely response would be her trying to convince him this was a bad idea, whether with her words or a swift kick to the head. And this right here, reminding him that she was a servant who must do whatever he requested of her, that was exactly the sort of cruel, heartless, low-down tactic a Feng would employ in the pursuit of her duties. He knew better than to ask what Soifone might do if he actually ordered her to accept the invitation. She would. But it wouldn't mean anything. That was just Feng obeying her liege's command. This went beyond that. And he wanted her to understand. "Nice try, Feng." He smiled at her, undaunted by those chilly eyes and whipcord muscles capable of tearing his head off. "Let's try again. How would you?" He pointed at her meaningfully, earning a faint flicker of an eyebrow possibly indicating annoyance. "Like to go on a date with me?" And he pointed to himself. "You are a child. I want nothing to do with you in any regard other than my professional capacity. Another telling blow. Maybe it was time he tried hitting below the belt too. I like you, Feng. If the graveyard had been dead silent before, now it was an absolute void of sound. Like the lingering remnants of every Shinigami here stretching back for thousands of years suddenly held their breaths, nudging their neighbors and whispering, "Can you believe he just said that to her? I know, he's so dead." Her teeth were grinding hard enough to be audible. "Noboru-sama." She growled low. "I'll admit, it came as a shock to me as well," he continued like this was the most natural conversation in existence. Which it very much wasn't. If Feng knew just how much strain he was under right now, she might actually feel sorry for him. "But I've gotten to know you better over the years. You're not the antiquated killing machine I first took you for, you're a lady with real history and class. What more could a prince ask for? Someone who will not kill you in your sleep." Feng spoke with a level of icy dispassion that would surely have spelled death for anyone not named Shihoan by now. Noboru remained unfazed. He stared right back at her, perfectly at ease. "See? You've even got a sense of humor. People might look at us and think we're so completely different we'd never hit it off. You remember when I said I'd find you a man? Well, I was serious about that. And I gave it a lot of thought. They'd have to be a great fighter, so at first I focused on the Kenpeki. It almost looked like she was about to puke there, so he quickly redirected the conversation. But I realized he doesn't have a sex life. I asked, even Gossip Girl Katetsu couldn't find any leads. So from there I zeroed in on his third seat, but the guy's kind of a blockhead and he'd probably say something that would get him killed on the first date. Now Feng appeared to be experiencing some kind of existential crisis. Had she never carried on a discussion like this before? No girl talk, ever? That came as no surprise. Maybe he should ask some of his lady friends to help her in that regard? Ganju Shiba, his brother Kon, that Giganti Chad who Ichigo Kurosaki went to school with ranked pretty high, but he's taken now. Where was I? Oh, right, you're Lieutenant Hisagi, or Captain Hichugaya. Are you insane? But none of them fit the bill. The kid threw up his hands in an expression of exasperation. I wanted you to be happy with whoever I found, so I thought they had to be someone who could match up with you, strong, quick, clever, kinda married to their job already, maybe a little bit crazy. All of a sudden he looked at her, and his face broke into a supremely warm-hearted smile the likes of which made Feng immediately see the resemblance to his mother, which prevented her from interrupting again. And then it hit me, I was going about this all wrong. Look at Ba-san and Kurosaki. They don't fit together at all at first glance. But when you watch them, and see just how invested they are in each other, in their lives, their habits, their devotion to making one another happy, you'd have to be an idiot not to see that they're really in love. And that's what I want for you, Feng. I want you to be loved. The previous agitation had passed. Now So iPhone sat still as the tombstone at her feet. She regarded him without expression, but it seemed clear that she was at least paying attention now. Not just arbitrarily dismissing his words as a mischievous child's impulsiveness. Could it be that he was actually getting through to her? Gold-rimmed gray eyes bore into her agate ones, trying desperately to get across what he really intended. I was thinking so much about all your good qualities that I forgot the bad ones. And after a while, I had to admit that I sort of kinda liked you. At first I couldn't believe it. I thought I must be going crazy, and I focused again on what an epically huge pain in the ass you were to be around. But that segued over into what a nice ass you have, and that got me thinking about your good points again, and from there it just gradually built up to what we have today. I appreciate that you value me, Noboru-sama. She then reached out and placed her hand over his heart, a move that surprised and excited him at the same time. Could she feel how fast it was going? Is she going to try a sneak attack? Does she want me to put up a fight, like Mama and Papa did when they first started dating, or? But what we have, is an oath. One that can never be broken. She could practically feel his heart skip a beat. So iPhone focused unblinkingly on his face, letting this loving, trusting soul understand how much that meant to her. I will serve you faithfully. I will act in your best interests. I will even die for you if needs be, whether or not there is another in my line who will continue to carry on our name. She made a gesture down at the grave of her family's benefactor, as though to emphasize what it meant. But though I live for you, I cannot live with you. You are the sun. I am simply a shadow cast by your light. And though it might pain you to hear this, I do not wish for anything more. His body was shaking as So-iPhone stood up. There was neither cruelty nor compassion to be found in the way she looked down on him now. Only resolve. Report to your detachment in Hueco Mundo. Someone will be watching you to ensure your safety during the operation, but it will not be me. Do not fail in your mission. She withdrew then, leaving him alone. He tried to draw in a breath, and it turned into a sob. Whoa, easy there, kid. Don't overdo it. Hey, listen to me, you're gonna be alright. Why here? Of course I am. Noboru wiped a forearm across his eyes angrily. He didn't care that he had spoken out loud. No one was around to hear it anyway. At first the boy tried telling himself that he had suspected as much, and there were still many paths he could take here. Only when he tried to stand, his legs gave out halfway, and he found himself sitting heavily back down again to collapse forward. Sprawled on the manicured grass, he started sobbing with frustration and unrequited longing. Why does this have to hurt so much? I'm crying like some stupid kid. Why did I have to go and do that? I should have waited, maybe till I'm older, then she wouldn't have just shot me down because I am just a kid. Noboru? Be quiet. Leave me alone. Even as he thought this, what felt like a hand settled on the top of his head. Don't ever give up on the ones you love, someone spoke. Who the? The young prince sat up with a start. He peered about the grounds, but no one was to be found. Not Feng, not anyone. Blinking, he remained confused and uncertain for a while. Then, almost against his volition, his eyes drew down to the name on the gravestone once more. It read. Daiichi Yamada. Some lingering impression left him sure he had heard that name before. What he knew for certain, however, was that the previous self-pity and feeling of worthlessness had passed. Instead Noboru Shihoan found himself filled with fresh resolve. Okay. Round 1 goes to her. But this match isn't over yet, Feng. Just wait and see. In love with a lady who doesn't love you? Kind of a running theme in this story, huh? You said it. Maybe I should talk to someone who knows the kind of situation I'm in? Like Kon, or Renji. Or Kian Katetsu. Not unless you want to sit through another 3 hours of hearing her gabble on about how great her Nii-sama is. Good point. Looks like Captain Abarai it is. Good thing we're on a mission together. That means he can't get away. Attaboy. Go get him. Grill those lovelorn losers and let Cupid's arrow fly. Exacta. Unbeknownst to Noboru, somewhere in the Viper Company headquarters, Hisagi Shihei shivered violently. Wondering if he might be coming down with a cold, he went to brew some tea. Nell's pregnant. I'm the father. Someone nearby coughed. Ah, Lieutenant Abarai? We've received the go-ahead from Soul Society. Shall we proceed? Renji glanced over at the person who had spoken, then turned away. Yeah. Sure, Rikaki. Let's go. He began to walk forward across the shifting sands, his Zanpakuto resting comfortably on his shoulder in its released form. Behind him came the soft, steady tramp from hundreds of disciplined Shinigami. Their resolve held firm despite what lay before them. Yet all the same, he knew how important it was that they see an officer go in first. Lead by example. How else could you get them to walk into certain death? Nell's pregnant. I'm the father? Only a few feet ahead loomed the oversized wall of howling sand and wind that comprised the dead zone of Hueco Mundo. This locale had served as a boundary marker for ages, only the strongest of hollows dared venture past its border in hopeful search of what might lie within. The grains of silica gleamed sharp as glass, moving at speeds that practically rendered them bullets. A person who walked in there unprotected would be flayed alive in under a minute. Nell's pregnant. I'm the father? Activate your Raishukaku, the lieutenant called out. At the same time, he thumbed a ring on his right hand. Immediately the small glass globe set into it activated, and he began to feed his Ryotsu to it as instructed. Immediately a barrier formed around him. Without hesitation the grim-faced fighter stepped into the dead zone. Nothing happened. A clear spherical space now existed around him past which the gale could not penetrate. Renji allowed himself a small sigh of relief. This bit of Shiba sorcery was really something. Once upon a time, it had enabled Ichigo and his Ryoka cohorts to penetrate the supposedly impassable barrier around the Seirei in spectacular fashion. Lord Commander Kukaki had approached Kyokaku about using her family's technology to give all their people safe passage into the dead zone. After rigorous instruction in their use from both the lady and her brother, she had then volunteered poor Ganju to prove its worth by entering the dead zone himself. In the end, she had to kick him in, but he came out without a scratch. Now it was time for their long-awaited planning to bear fruit. Renji had thought about little else for the past 3 years. He remained committed to his aspiration. But now, Nell's pregnant. I'm the father? Renji, dear boy. I know you're long used to having voices in your head, but if you carry on like this, you're really going to develop a split personality. You must focus, brother. Do not let what you recently learned consume your thoughts. All will be well. How can you guys say that? For one thing, Nell's pregnant. For another thing, I might be the father. Yes, we've established that. Anything new to report? Yeah. Despite all that, she still insists on leading this mission. That was rather more cause for concern than he had previously held. Right now on the other side of the dead zone, Captain Nilil Tuadolshvank was heading up her own detachment from Siamese Company. The Vazard captains, accompanied by a corresponding lieutenant apiece, were in charge of their own brigades. Shinji Hirako commanded forces hand-selected from Ibis Squad, many of which had served under him during his tenure as head of the 5th Division. His partner had gotten members of Greyhound for the same reason. They could reassure the other Shinigami who never met those two men of their effectiveness and trustworthiness. The goal of this operation was both far-reaching and far-sighted. At its core, it was simply an attempt to breach and pacify the dead zone. Groups of sorcerers from the Kido Corps and the Arashi clan's Misho accompanied every detachment, bearing the materials to construct permanent towers within those deadly confines. These fortifications would serve as beacons and waypoints. Should either of their targets approach within a certain vicinity, the outposts would send a message to the gathered Shinigami army alerting them, allowing them to pinpoint their locations. Spells could then be deployed to give them immediate access and pull off a coordinated attack. In this way, the Godi I-7 aimed to eliminate both Grimjo Jaggerjax and Rajuro Odoribashi. Of course for the Vazard, it also held a personal element. Finally a chance to dispose of their murderous former comrade had come. Renji liked to think the same for himself, though. He had a bone to pick with Grimjo, after all. As the last Espada left in Hueco Mundo, the Sexter represented his only real chance to defeat one of their number on his own and thereby complete the task he had assigned himself those many years ago. For upon taking careful self-reflection of himself, Renji Abarai had decided that he needed a win. Something real and solid he could hold up to the world, and Nell, to show them, and her, that he was worth another look. A captain was no big deal. Sheesh, there were practically dozens of them lying around, retired or not. But an Espada Slayer? A person who took on one of the most dangerous breed to ever crawl out of Hueco Mundo, a remorseless killer handpicked by Aizen Sosuke himself to lead his armies against Soul Society? That would serve as a real accomplishment. A way to distinguish himself. They could then all see that he wasn't just some hick from the sticks who lucked into a captaincy because a bunch of them got depowered or flat out defected. Renji Abarai was a champion of their world, willing to risk his life to subdue a threat against them all. And Nell in particular. Because Jaggerjax had left little doubt that he considered the captains of Siamese Company to be his personal prey, ever since the Autumn War. Eliminating that threat would have to serve as Renji's way of assuring Nell he didn't view her as a cheap fling, a roll in the hay, a tussle in the sheets. He held her in high regard no matter what some might whisper behind the Ajicha's general's back. She wasn't a substitute for his unrequited affections. He stayed with her all those years because she was an exciting and amazing person who had a rockin' body and could probably eat him if she wanted to. Also, Nell's pregnant. With my kid, and, possibly Komamura's. How did that work out, exactly? For now, he decided to occupy his thoughts with the job at hand. And so Renji led his force deeper into the dead zone, towards one of the pre-selected points they had established thanks to recon work done beforehand. Upon arrival, work proceeded swiftly. The Corps and their Arashi mages began to construct the waypost inside the safety of their group's combined Raishukaku barriers, which covered a fairly large space and afforded them a decent view of their surroundings. Standing apart from the building crew, Renji's eyes scanned their environment from behind a pair of pricey sunglasses. This was part of the first ring they planned to form, followed by concentric circles within that eventually might lead to the very heart of the dead zone, which they speculated might be where Rogero and Grimjo were hiding. Neither had been seen or heard from in years, but their continued existence had never come into doubt. The Vazard insisted Odoribashi, or the hollow he had become, still lived. And from what he had seen for himself, Renji knew that the Sexta Espada was one tough customer who should never be counted out. His lifelong goal was to become a Vastolord. And if he ever actually succeeded in that respect, well, he'd seen what one of those monsters could do. Even with everyone on their side, from Kenpei Kazaraki to Ichigo Kurosaka to the captains themselves, in the end should it come to blows against a Vastolord, it was still a toss-up who'd come out on top. So they had to end it now before that ever became an issue. With Grimjo dead, I can move on. I can leave all my old worries behind. Aizen's locked away in Nirvana, he's never getting out. I wonder, did Anohana survive? Did she join Zero Squad and lead the fight against him? Maybe they're still battling it out right now. Damn, I wished she was here. I'd give anything for one last chance to tell Retsu how I really felt, how her touch made me feel, how I wished we could. Switching your sights already, Renji? You really can't help yourself, can you? The voice of imaginary Ayasukawa disturbed him so much he almost missed the telltale flash of movement just beyond the limit of the Raishukaku barrier. Guilt and self-recrimination took a backseat to battle training and duty. Whipping Zabumaru on high, Renji was just about to let fly, when a shape sprang from those swirling confines and struck him in the shoulder. He cursed, stumbling backwards, his attack thwarted, but before he could shout an alarm. Sorry, El Capitan. Just didn't want to be hit by any friendly fire, you know. Recognition and irritation dawned even as the person behind the attack emerged into sight. A long red power pole retracted back into his hand as he came up before the angry fighter, and Noboru Shihoin grinned cheekily up at the tall captain with Hanuman draped casually over one shoulder. The young member of the stealth forces sported an earring containing his own Raishukaku globe, enabling him to traverse the dead zone unmolested. So how's it going? Noboru strolled on by Renji without regard for having just assaulted a captain. There were times this kid behaved more like his father than he might ever believe, acting as though he could do no wrong and everyone should just get out of his way. But at least he seemed to be taking his assignment seriously. We're making progress, his red-headed ally stated tersely, trying not to make it sound like he was giving a status report to the kid. As if he needed an even more swelled head. Anything from your end? Noboru left off examining the undertaking and swung to face him. Not a peep. I was just thinking about ducking out and going to explore. His head shifted restlessly from one side to another. Any idea which direction Las Noches might be? Probably a ton of interesting loot left over there. We picked that place clean years ago. It's dead. Zabumaru still at the ready, Renji turned back to scanning the perimeter. Just stay here with us for the time being. Better bored than dead. Boredom's for people who are too scared to go looking for fun, Noboru corrected him. But I get what you mean. In a flash he hopped forward, and before Renji could even react, a small black monkey had landed on his shoulder. It grinned at him for a moment. You mind? 4 eyes are better than 2. Get off. With irritation he sought to shrug the pest away. I thought you were outgrowing this shit, kid. I'm accommodating. Might as well get away with it while. All of a sudden Noboru went still. His head rose, black eyes blinking fast. Renji took notice. What's wrong? Do you feel something? Quickly he scanned their environment for sign of what might have raised Noboru's hackles. Don't you hear it? What? This situation was making him nervous. Boasting unusually sharp ears, the former street thief allowed himself to grow still the way he sometimes did back when hiding in the alleys, waiting for his pursuers to pass and it was safe to emerge. But nothing beyond the endless howl of the dead zone met him. The song. It's here. It's in this place. Noboru spoke fast now, like he was too excited to explain. I couldn't hear it all the time, but now all of a sudden, it just started up. He looked at Renji, an expression of incredulity on that simian countenance. Do you not hear that? When Renji only stared back without saying a word, the monkey uttered a curse and leapt off his shoulder to go racing into the storm. Noboru. The young prince of the Shihoin moved as fast as he could, speeding recklessly in pursuit of that elusive melody. There were no words that he could discern in the song. Instead he heard only pain and grief, all mixed with a plaintive call for help that tugged him irresistibly on. Nothing visible existed beyond the range of his protective barrier. All the same, he realized he wasn't making much progress moving as a monkey. With a curse, Noboru dropped his animal guise, reverting to a naked boy before powering through the storm. But in the howling of the gale around him, he suddenly found he couldn't make out the song anymore. Hey! Where are you? He shouted in desperation, pivoting about in an attempt to catch a trace of it once more. I'm here. Do you hear? Tell me where you are. Nothing. Just the mad roar of this cyclone beating at his ears, mocking him in his impotent frustration. When no new leads came, it occurred to him that he had done something very stupid coming out here alone. There were other enemies besides their targets living in the dead zone. Hollows the likes of which made the regular denizens of Hueco Mundo pale in comparison, leftovers from the time of Barragan Lusenburn's rule, and horrors that might never have been human to begin with. Before any of them could find him, he'd best make his way back to rejoin his comrades at base camp. Which was, where, exactly? Uncertainly Noboru looked behind him. Did I come from that way, or am I all turned around? As he stood debating, a rushing noise reached his ears. Before he could even think about it, Noboru already dove to the ground. Just in time, as something huge went swooping over him, uttering an angry roar. The young agent regained his feet smoothly, whipping out Hanuman as he did so. Through the morass of sand and dirt around him, he caught a glimpse of an absolutely gigantic shape flapping away. He sent his Zanpakuto snapping out after it, but though Hanuman extended well past the range of his force field, he still struck nothing. Wish I could bend. Like a whip, yeah? That way I could cover more area with an attack instead of just a straight line. We'll work on that later. Right now we have to concentrate on getting out of here. Around him, the barrier flickered. Noboru realized he had neglected to concentrate his energy into the Raishukaka orb. In this environment, that could prove fatal. Striving to calm himself, he refocused his abilities, just as what felt like a semi slammed into him from behind. The impact drove Noboru into the desert hard. It knocked the breath out of his lungs, and he inhaled a mouthful of sand at the same time. Coughing and struggling to draw breath, his control faltered. And with that, the protection of the Raishukaka dissipated, leaving him at the mercy of the storm. Noboru had never felt anything like this before. It took his breath away even as he managed to gasp in a lungful of air. The wind hit like a huge hollow's fist, sending him tumbling helplessly across the wind-blasted plain without stop. Sand tore into his skin hard enough to draw blood. Horrified, the prince could only scream in agony as he felt himself being flayed alive. Then even that was cut off, as a giant clawed foot crashed down and bore him to the ground. For just an instant he felt glad, because being crushed like this actually diminished the amount of his skin vulnerable to the sandstorm. But as his bones began to creak, that quickly became cold comfort. Struggling to breathe through gritted teeth, he managed to crack an eye open. Over him there loomed a huge white mask. Hollow. The beast's mouth suddenly opened wide. As it bent to devour him, Noboru Shihoin felt a strange medley of confusion, disbelief, exasperation, and guilt. With death approaching, the only thing he could remember was one of So-iPhone's lessons. When all else fails, help. His voice seemed pitiful in comparison to the tempest all around them. but all the same, someone heard. A dull boom sounded. Above him the huge hollow went soaring back with a screech, abandoning its prey. Too stunned to question, Noboru instinctively sought to move, only for this to reinvigorate his injuries from before, leaving him bleeding and moaning helplessly. Do not move. Not like he could, but okay. Moments later the fallen soldier felt a gentle hand press against his naked back. With it came the whisper of healing Kido, serving to rejuvenate him. Though visibility remained diminished, he still recalled the danger they were in, and looked back towards where he had last seen his attacker. The desert around them was clear. Towards the edge of this protected space, his blurred vision made out a huge black shape, mighty wings flapping slowly as it hung against the storm. But it did not attack. For between it and him stood a figure robed in white. An arm extended out to one side, revealing a gleaming spike like an elongated fingernail. With no fear whatsoever this slight figure marched forward towards the heartless horror. A long braid of hair swung behind them. Is that Feng? There came a roar greater than even the dead zone's med noise. With that, the hollow sprang backward to go rushing through the wall of sand. The sound of wings beating furiously diminished into the distance along with any trace of the hollow's presence. Noboru shut his eyes tight as the wind of its passing stung him with more sand. Still, it didn't hurt much. Maybe something to do with the person healing him. You may stand now. He realized it was a woman who had spoken. That reminded him of his current denuded state, and without another thought for the potential peril around them, he hopped nimbly upright. A bit of magic manifested his stealth force's uniform once again, and with some adroit wiggling and stretching, the prince managed to dress himself in record time. Satisfied of his dignity being intact, he turned to regard his rescuers. Oh, hey. It's you. Green eyes stared back without a hint of recognition in their depths. Even as she rose to stand over him, Nimue Kuratsuka maintained a passive expression that in no way indicated how close they might have just come to death. The lieutenant of Ibis Company only gave a small inclination of her head. Young Master Shihoan. Check for needle marks. She might have injected you on the sly. Utterly absurd. This scratchy voice caught his attention as a slight man in a white coat went barging past them. Noboru gave a start as Mayuri Kuratsuka spun his head about and snapped, Nimue. Secure the boy. We're leaving. Yes, Mayuri-sama. Noboru found himself plucked off his feet and held under the crook of the emotionless woman's arm. Nimue opened a large sunshade and took up step beside her parent, solicitously shielding him with the umbrella despite there being neither sun nor wind to disturb his stroll. Before he could even think to question this arrangement, they were off. Gazing somewhat blankly ahead, Noboru's attention was caught by the sweep of a long blue indigo braid draped down Mayuri's back. The madman held a hand up near his head, snapping his fingers restlessly. Doing so drew the eye to the ridiculously long middle fingernail, a sign of privilege in olden imperial times. Oh, so he's the one I saw. Try not to be disappointed. Did you think she was secretly tailing you because your impassioned confession melted her cold heart? No. I mean, maybe for a second, okay? Man, you are still a kid. He let himself feel that humiliation for all it's worth, even greater than being slung around like this by a woman. Their odd party continued on, the dead zone seemingly kept at bay by another energy field similar to the Raishukaku, but different as well. It traveled with them, emanating either from the demented scientist or his obedient offspring. Or both. I wonder where we're going? It didn't take long to find the answer. The storm retreated before them, revealing a creature so bizarre Noboru could only gape in disbelief. It looked almost like some kind of giant hairless gorilla squatting on its haunches. The thing had blue skin of a rather pretty turquoise shade which was entirely out of place on its misshapen body. It looked to be about 20 feet tall at the head, that is, if it had a head. Where a neck and skull should have been, there was nothing but a smooth stretch of unblemished skin and shoulders. A palanquin with white silken draperies took up space between the great brute's shoulder blades. It was here their path ended. At their approach, a purple carpet unrolled like magic to form a staircase leading up to the covered carriage. Mayuri ascended first, grumbling all the while, with Nimue and Noboru bringing up the rear. Numerous cushions were spread on the small space of the palanquin. Flopping down onto a pile with legs crossed, the sour scientist produced a riding crop and struck savagely at the headless beast's sides. Up! He groused. Their conveyance obediently did so, leaning forward until it crouched down on all fours with knuckles buried in the sand. Forward! Another flick of the lash, and the blue-skinned brute began trundling forward at an awkward but careful gait. Between its shoulder blades, the palanquin swayed back and forth as though they were riding a particularly ungainly camel. But it remained in place, and the trio's departure proceeded without further ado. At a nod from her father, Nimue consented to deposit Noboru, who quickly copied his host's position to sit cross-legged on the cushions. Maybe it was delayed reaction to a near-death experience, or the simple craziness of this whole situation, but he found himself in a state rather resembling euphoria. And so Noboru wasted no time rattling off, "Thanks for saving me, Clown Kurotsuki." I mean Clan Kurotsuki, he corrected himself when Mayuri's golden eyes narrowed. "What are you doing out here, anyway?" Having pulled a hookah from nowhere, the scientist took a drag on this pipe and exhaled a stream of blue smoke through his nose. He had on a red fez with a long golden tassel, and a gold-rimmed monocle was attached to his coat by a delicate gold chain. Adjusting the sword tucked through a purple sash at his waist, Mayuri reclined back and said, "We were collecting specimens. That one in particular was a rather remarkable sort, and would have made for an excellent research subject. That is, until you came blundering in and ruined our hunt." Noboru realized he was referring to the huge hollow. So they had been hunting it? Crazier things had happened. Perhaps contrition was in order? "Sorry about that, Your Eminence." He bowed forward quickly at the waist and came back upright. "I'm still young, and despite my family's best efforts, I screw up a lot. If I can make it up to you in any way, just ask." Mayuri sank back into his seat with a rumble of disquieting laughter. "Oh, have no doubt that I will, boy. You can rest assured that your family will compensate me for my troubles." He appeared to be mollified somewhat at this thought. Or maybe it was the title, Your Eminence. Noboru had abruptly remembered that Aunt Rukia told him she used this to refer to Mayuri when they met, and it always pleased him, so he had followed suit. Certainly didn't seem to hurt in this situation. "For the time being, you may enjoy our hospitality." The med scientist's monocle flashed as he darted a look at his daughter. "Nimue. Show the wounded prince some courtesy." "Yes, Mayuri-sama." When she reached over and pulled his head down to rest in her lap, by this point Noboru felt certain he must have suffered a concussion. What other explanation could there be for all this wacky stuff happening? However, when the pallid beauty began to rhythmically stroke his hair in a soothing fashion, twining her slender fingers through his inky locks, he came to the conclusion that hallucination or not, this was damn comfortable. And so he just went along. It was when he had just felt himself drifting off to sleep that it occurred to him losing consciousness around Mayuri Kurotsuki might be interpreted as an invitation to exploratory surgery, and he abruptly fired off a question to keep himself awake. "Say, Your Excellency? Pregunta loca, but by any chance, did you happen to hear a song right before we met?" Mayuri's head tilted to what looked like a painful angle, incisors worrying his lower lip and smoke drifting from his nostrils. "Song? No. I've never had a song stuck in my head. Too much going on up here for that." He tapped his forehead meaningfully. For all that, though, a glitter of something inscrutable made his golden eyes flash, and he bent down to peer into the prince's eyes. "What did it sound like, pray tell?" In a distant voice, Noboru recalled. "Like someone in pain asking for help." Far from being annoyed, an expression that might have almost been sympathy passed over those painted features. Well. Perhaps we gained something interesting after all." He then brought up a holographic screen and keyboard to begin typing away diligently, ignoring them both. While Nimue continued to give him a scalp massage, the exhausted prince once again had to fight off sleep. He let his eyes wander around, settling on their transport's tremendous shoulders moving up and down. "Huh, that's funny. It looks like there's a Big 10 tattooed on its quadricep. Maybe it's a model number? Like for cars. Mayuri might have a whole stable of these things. Let's remember not to ask about that." "Gotcha." They continued on their way out of the dead zone. back where they had left, so iPhone remained on guard in case the enemy returned. She remonstrated herself internally for allowing Noboru to slip his leash like that. But she had caught up to him in time. Of course, his current host was not to be trusted any more than a hollow. So iPhone prepared herself to keep a discreet but watchful pursuit until they were in more trustworthy company. Before she did, however, the Viper Company captain gave one last look back in the direction in which the huge hollow disappeared. Was it her imagination, or had she felt something back there? An almost familiar feeling. Irrelevant. Yes. You're right. Let us return to what matters. And so she began her stealthy pursuit of the blue behemoth and its troublesome burden. Movie night at the Usagi Shoten had come. It was an event that all involved looked forward to. One day a week, the kids were allowed to pick a sweet of their choice from the store's stock while they all sat in the den and watched the show together. This time it had been Ichigo's turn to pick the title, and for their viewing pleasure he selected the classic anime series Dororo, a tale of samurai and demons set in the Warring States period. While there wasn't enough time to watch the entire season, he felt certain his selection would resonate sufficiently to make his family clamor for more. If that dog barks again, I'm going to scream. Sadly, this was not quite the case. Blowing out his breath, Ichigo reached over and plucked a strawberry-flavored Pocky from his daughter's possession. Hey! Hirako yelped, snatching the packet up and glowering at him. Her father simply shrugged and proceeded to crunch down on his purloined treat, a subtle reminder that life wasn't always fair. This is so old, their daughter complained again as she sprawled on the floor, flinging out her bare feet and glowering at the flickering black and white screen as though its lack of color offended her. Shush, Kuko, Shotoka scolded her mildly. He only used this old nickname when he felt she was being a pest, and when his little sister elbowed him sharply for it, he added, I like it. If it's not your thing, you can just go to your room. You would. And stop talking like you're an adult already, she retorted, burrowing back against the sofa and crossing her arms. You're 13 years old. It's creepy. That's enough. With a sigh, Ichigo reached down and squeezed his daughter's head lightly. She grumbled and fussed a little, but consented to pipe down, and he settled back into the joy of her mother's embrace. The drawings are beautiful, Rukia murmured, snuggling up against him on the futon couch. Ichigo was secretly glad to find her so appreciative, and would have happily continued the conversation. But some things took precedence. Gonna use the bathroom, he whispered in her ear. Rukia gave a grunt of comprehension without taking her eyes from the screen. She appeared to be enthralled, so his choice was a hit with at least two of his critics. The third had proven hard to please of late, but maybe it had something to do with age. Supposedly girls matured faster than boys. He would need to have a talk with Dad if things got any worse. Ishine Kurosaki used to come over for movie night, complaining that the house was cold and empty now with both girls away at college. But he seemed to have less time and inclination of late. Nanao might have something to do with that. Sliding open the lavatory, Ichigo flicked on the light and nearly screamed upon finding a man peering in through the bathroom window. Fortunately for his dignity, he recognized the flaming red coxcomb right away. Shutting the door quickly, Ichigo raced over and flung open the window. Renji! He hissed. What the hell do you think you're? I gotta talk to you. There was a wild, desperate look in the other man's eye that made him bite back whatever he had been about to say. Ichigo came to a decision. With a careful look over his shoulder, he hoisted himself over the frame to join his unforeseen visitor outside the house, keeping the window open in case a speedy retreat was needed. Upon finding his feet, he was surprised to find the Shinigami captain wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and bandana. Clearly this was a Jigai, but why would such a thing be necessary? Renji caught the way he was looking at him and glanced down. Untraceable Jigai, he whispered hoarsely, scratching at his chest as though it itched to be wearing mortal garb. I didn't want Rukia to know I was here. Ichigo scowled in confusion. So you waited outside our bathroom. I needed to catch you alone. The captain's eyes darted about nervously, as though he were a criminal in fear of pursuit. Renji then drew closer, and his tone dropped an octave. Something's happened. Something big. A chill stole over him. Aizen. What? No. Fuck that guy. This is bigger than that. Now Ichigo felt thoroughly confused. Renji. He spoke in a tone normally reserved for dealing with unruly customers on the job. Maybe you want to calm down and explain to me what's going on. Maddened eyes blinked rapidly. For the first time it seemed as though Renji had some idea of how he must look. His shoulders sagged, and he shut his eyes to take a deep breath. When they opened again, he had grown a lot more calm. The haggard Shinigami then looked at Ichigo and said in a fierce voice, "Neil's pregnant." To his relief, Ichigo stopped himself from saying congratulations in time. That would have been all kinds of wrong, considering what he knew about the living arrangements both top members of Siamese Company currently shared. Instead he responded with, "And I think it's mine." A very salient point cropped up right then. "I thought you two broke up." "We did." "When?" "5 years ago." Ichigo let that statement sink in. When it didn't seem to have quite the effect he had hoped, he then asked in as delicate a fashion as possible, "And since then, she's been living with Komamura, right?" "At least, that's what I heard from Ishida." Funnily enough, the Quincy was expecting his first child in about a month. "Gotta remember to get something classy for the baby shower." The twitch in Renji's eye drew his attention back to the prospective madman. "What I mean is," Ichigo added quickly, "if you haven't been together in 5 years, then why? Are you not listening to me?" Renji demanded hotly. "A hollow is pregnant with a Shinigami's child. What about that sounds like it should make any sort of sense." "Ichigo." Both men froze as Rukia's voice carried in from the house. Hurriedly he stuck his head back through the window. "Yeah. Is everything all right in there?" "Yeah, sure. Just say the first thing that comes to mind." "I'm having trouble forcing it out." "It's a groaner." Silence. "Then we sell a product for that, you know." "I know." This was fast becoming the most humiliating moment of his life. "Hold on. I'll get you a box and leave it by the door." "Thanks, sweetie." The sound of her footsteps departing down the hall allowed his stomach to unclench a little. Turning back to the source of this night's troubles, he found Renji flattened against the side of the building like a thief looking to evade capture. "Time to get serious." "Renji, why did you want to talk to me?" Satisfied that he was not in danger of being caught, the harried fugitive disengaged himself from the wall and stood up straight. "I'm going to be a father." Debatable, he thought privately. "And?" Abarai stared at him. His throat worked up and down. Finally he blurted out, "How do you do it? How do you be a parent?" Right then it all became clear. And just like that, any lingering animosity or frustration at being put in this situation went away. Because the anxiety gripping his friend at this very moment was one he himself had experienced to a dispiriting degree. Ichigo Kurosaka felt closer to Renji Abarai in that moment than at any other point in their lives together, or deaths. Even the shared camaraderie of battle or aiming to rescue the same woman couldn't compare to this. "Renji." He gripped the Shinigami captain's shoulders, gone iron hard with stress. "You're scared right now. And yes, I know exactly how that feels. But trust me." A happy smile split his face, so real it caused even Renji's anxiety to die down at the sight. "It gets better. And when the time comes, you will love this." "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "Okay, thanks, man." The tension had gone out of him. Once more Renji looked like a human being. He gripped Ichigo's hand in his, squeezing tightly, which he reciprocated in a true show of male solidarity. They both smiled at each other then, and laughed a little, recognizing how this should be an awkward moment for each of them but not feeling in the least bit uncomfortable. After a while, Ichigo indicated with his head back inside. "Okay. I'm gonna go crawl back into my bathroom now." "Right." Neither of them seemed to find anything odd about that remark. "I'll let you know how things work out." Then, in a nervous rush he said, "Don't tell anybody, all right? Especially Rukia. We've still got a lot of details to work out, and there's the big mission coming, not sure when, but I'll definitely keep you in the loop. I'm looking forward to it." They exchanged a nod. Afterwards Renji turned and disappeared into the night. True to his word, Ichigo took this chance to clamber through the window. As promised, a box of gastrointestinal assistance merch was waiting for him out in the hall. He took it with him and rejoined his family, who were arguing hotly about whether or not a man could actually survive with no body parts. So eyes, ears, arms, did the demons get his balls too? Mom. Yup. They were definitely going to watch this series to the end. To be continued. Chapter 32, War Approaches, Hunting for Answers. It's so quiet here now. Yes. But that is for the best. Rukia Kukaki walked alone through the halo that was once her responsibility to oversee. A temporary residence designed to house the displaced residents of Soul Society, the heavenly relocation oases all had very similar layouts. Viewed from the outside, their design reminded her of tremendous conch shells made up of a vast winding white ribbon formed from solid spirit particles that swirled around a central spire. Homes, parks, and entertainment sites were set up along that band, from top to bottom. They were all rather basic in terms of accommodations, being crafted on the fly. But up till now, they had served their purpose well. No cause for complaints for the most part. Only the time had finally come for the halos to be retired. Their last residents were being transferred over to homes in the new heavenly planes. Once that was completed, these serviceable structures would be broken down into the spiritual components from which they were first made. Of course, that necessitated making sure all the inhabitants were safely evacuated. Which was precisely why Rukia was here now. The last of the holdouts required her personal attention. At last she came upon one small nondescript home out of many. Around her the once bustling neighborhood stood empty, deserted. Only a hermit would find such environs appealing. Well, here goes. She rang the bell and waited. After a while, the sound of someone approaching came from the other side. Who is it? A fearful voice whispered. Rukia Kukaki. After a few moments of debate, there came the drawing of a latch, and several locks clicking. Then finally the door opened a crack, allowing anxious eyes to peer out. May I come in, Hitsujikai-san? Hesitation at first. Then former Shinigami Yoshi Hitsujikai bobbed his head nervously in agreement and stood aside for her to enter. When Rukia did, he quickly shut the door behind her, leaving the street empty once more. Welcome, Captain Hitsugaya, a servant greeted him as he entered the foyer. He seemed in no way surprised at this unannounced visit by such a high-ranked official. His lordship shall be informed of your arrival. If you will follow me, I can escort you to a suitable. This can't wait. And with that Toshiro Hitsugaya brushed past the man and set off down the hall. Normally the young warrior made a point to observe good social graces. A holdover from his childhood, when people expected the worst of him due to his appearance. It helped to minimize conflicts. You're in a hurry today. He has good reason. Yeah, we get that. But haste makes waste. You're opening up a can of worms, kid. The argument of his dual Zanpakuto faded as memory guided him along. At last Toshiro found himself standing before a nondescript room. The door was closed, but he could hear rustling. The master of the house must be in attendance. Before you go barging in, just remember who you're dealing with. If anyone knows this man, it's us, so don't. Toshiro slid the door open with a bang. Kiraku-sama, forgive me, but... AEP. There came the briefest glimpse of a girl in a maid's uniform as she quickly dove onto her bed. Books went spilling everywhere as the frightened servant cowered under the covers. After a moment, the embarrassed captain mumbled, "Sorry to disturb you." So saying, he shut the door and left. Okay. So that was his girlfriend's bedroom, not Kiraku's. I jumped the gun. Indeed. Hardly an auspicious beginning. Leave him alone. That was cute. It ill behooves us to behave indecorously at this junction. Remember our reason for being here. We understand. But are you sure you want to do this now, kid? What if he recognizes us? Your secret might get out. I have to talk to someone about this. Someone who will understand and care. A tightness in his throat made both swords and their master fall silent. Hitsugaya Toshiro proceeded on his way through the comfortable confines of a mansion belonging to Shunsui Kiraku, former captain of the Godi I-13. As he did, he rehearsed what he had to say. Captain Kiraku? No, Lord Kiraku. Forgive the interruption. I'm here because, my mother, she used to work for you, and she's dying. Coming to a halt at an intersection, that noble figure angrily struck a wall post. One hand clasped roughly against his eyes to prevent any tears from falling. Teeth gritted, fist digging into the wood, he fought to control a swell of desperate loss. Since learning of their true relationship, Hitsugaya had made more of an effort to find time for Granny, or rather, Shirabe. They talked about the past, moments, and references that only they and one other person would recognize and value. It made him glad that they could be so open with each other. No more need for secrets. His mother was the only person alive he had told about his experience in the deadly trials, and how it had changed him. She burst out weeping at the thought of his death, but he reassured her that he was perfectly fine and could now command far greater powers in his defense than ever before. This was little consolation to Granny. Still, she took heart that her little boy was still with her. The first sign something might be amiss was small. Shirabe seemed to have lost her appetite. Whenever they met, she always made sure to have food ready for him. But after a while he noticed she was serving him more and more, without taking much for herself. When he finally mustered the courage to ask, she insisted he still needed his nutrition as a growing boy and she would have anything he didn't finish off later. This excuse only made him nervous. For several months, she had appeared confused, often asking him the same question multiple times, and only seeming to realize it after he gently reminded her. Cheerful as ever, his lifelong guardian brushed it off as her being a scatterbrained old biddy. But she always looked so tired lately. Last night, she nearly went to sleep right there at the dinner table. Frightened and dismayed, Toshiro insisted she go to bed immediately, overruling all her protests that she had just overexerted herself cooking and wasn't really sleepy. He helped her to bed and even brought her a bowl of soup which she consented to take a few mouthfuls for his benefit. After that they talked, with him waiting patiently as her attention slipped away from one sentence to the next, struggling to get her thoughts into words. Finally, when Granny did drift off to peaceful sleep, Toshiro couldn't stop himself from crying. He did so quietly, not wanting to disturb her rest. But the truth could no longer be denied. This kind, selfless, devoted woman who had borne him through unimaginable hardship and looked after him ever since, he would soon lose her forever. "I love you," he had sobbed wretchedly, and given her a tender kiss on the cheek. Shirabe continued to sleep undisturbed while her son remained at her bedside the whole night, unwilling to leave lest the worst happen and he not be there for her. More than anyone, Shirabe should not have to die alone. She should be with people who cared about her. But he couldn't stay here all the time. The duties of a captain demanded his attention. And while the thought of his mother passing away all by herself in this tiny little hut filled him with dread at the prospect, Toshiro recognized there was precious little he could do in this situation. "I only found out a few years ago. Why does this have to happen now? We should have more time together. Good people shouldn't die alone. She needs her family. Momo, where are you? Toshiro-kun." Caught up in his bitter grief, the boy captain looked up to find himself joined by none other than Kiraku Shunsui. The retired veteran of the Godi I-13 had on a light summer robe of black silk with the moon and stars of a cloudy sky sewn into it. His face was etched into an expression of surprise at finding Hitsugaya like this. And certainly he must be. But it was his companion who had spoken. "Oh no. Toshiro, guard yourself." Beside the mansion's owner stood Jushiro Yukitake, lord husband to Lady Isane of the Katetsu clan. The handsome legend wore his concern and bewilderment without regard for anyone who might see it. He had on a yutaka similar to his old friend's, white with great blue waves crested by foam, like something from a Japanese painting. Moonlight hair spilled down his shoulders, while deep brown eyes regarded the pale youth before them with concern. He had an almost paternal look about him. So distraught was he at being found out like this, Toshiro almost called the man father. He caught himself at the last second. While he must appear absolutely wretched right now, there was no way he could allow himself to give in to his feelings. Ever since Shirabe informed him that he was, in fact, Yukate's child by way of a spell-induced night of passion, Toshiro Hitsugaya had wrestled with the implications of his parentage. For most of his life he had considered himself an orphan, a stray, the unwanted get of a lover's tryst gone wrong at best. No loving parents would ever have given up their offspring to be raised by a stranger in the Rokanga. But ever since the day he learned of his true parentage, Toshiro had made no effort to seek out Yukatake in any way. Absurd, some might say. Having felt the lack of parental ties for so long, what kind of fool would not rush to form a relationship with his newly revealed sire? Regardless of their respective situations, or how they had looked upon each other while serving together in the military, surely now there could only be cause for rejoicing. Toshiro had a father, Jushiro had a son. They could surely smile and laugh about this while remembering all the times the old captain had unwittingly offered his son candy or made delighted exclamations about their similarity in names. And yet Toshiro couldn't bring himself to do it. Not for any specific reason, but because it simply felt weird. Was that a good enough reason to keep father and son apart? Possibly not. However, he had yet to find a worthwhile argument that might lead him to choose otherwise. Shirabe never asked him if he had sought out his father, possibly because she still didn't want him to have to deal with the result of their night together and all the headaches it would surely entail for a man married to one of the most powerful women in their world. Now here they stood at long last. Father and son united, even if one remained unaware. I should have known he might be here. I did advise caution, if you will recall. I'm still so used to feeling both of their spiritual energy even from a great distance. That sort of thing is hard to get over in just a few years. Hey, be thankful they can't feel yours anymore, otherwise there might be another issue to complicate things, remember? Please forgive me for putting you both through this. Don't be so hard on yourself, kid. Seriously, it's nice to see him doing well. We were always so worried about him. Now look at the guy. He's actually got some color in his cheeks. Maybe some aspect of Sogyo no Kodawari's delight at seeing their old wielder transferred over to Toshiro, for he found himself more in control of himself than just a moment past. The boy captain straightened upright, squared his shoulders and faced the two noblemen calmly. Lord Yukatake, Lord Shunsui, I hope you'll forgive this interruption. They exchanged a look, perhaps confused at his abrupt shift in attitude. From on the brink of tears to formal as a kukaki. At last Kiraku turned back to him and said slowly, well, think nothing of it, my good man. Yes, truly, we weren't busy with anything at all, Jushiro added in eager attempt to console him. Well, other than, I mean. Here he blushed and stood there beaming like somebody's proud grandfather. It made Toshiro uncomfortable seeing him like this. What he means, Toshiro-kun, his uncharacteristically sober companion spoke up when neither of them seemed to know what to say next, is that you'll have to call him daddy from now on. Toshiro's jaw clenched, eyes flinging wide with disbelief. He knows. Oh, stop that, you great oaf. Uttering an embarrassed laugh, Yukatake tweaked the other man's long silver-streaked ponytail. He then took a deep breath and turned back to the dumbstruck captain, swelling up with pride once more. But yes, it's true. Isane and I are going to have a child together. I just stopped by to spread the good news. Kiraku-sama. Hitsugaya suddenly spoke. There's something important I need to discuss with you. In private. Eyebrows rose quizzically on that ruggedly masculine face. Certainly. I'd be only too happy to oblige. A servant appeared at his elbow without being asked, and he informed her, escort Captain Hitsugaya to the garden. I'll be along shortly. She obediently held out an arm to beckon the boy on. Toshiro was only too pleased to follow, and the two of them went off together. Shunsui and Jushiro watched him go. After they rounded a corner, the white-haired noble leaned over and whispered, "Do you think he noticed?" "No way. We'd definitely have heard about it otherwise." "I'll take care of things, then," Yukatake decided. "You'd best go see what he has to say. Be careful. You too." And they separated, trailing secrets and power even now. Drawing closer to Aizen's quarters, Tissan's lip curled slightly in distaste as he felt the overwhelming presence of another palace resident approaching him down an intersecting hall. When they were visible to one another, Tia Halibel stopped to regard him with an equal level of disdain. "And where are you going?" As if she needed to ask. There was nothing in this wing of the palace but the imperial quarters. Kanem did not slow his pace as he strode past her. "To speak with my lord. You'll have to wait." The samurai stopped and half-turned, head tilted down slightly. "Why?" "Anohana has called a meeting of the Sankishi." Mockery dripped from her every word. "You don't hold that title, do you?" He hesitated, considering his options. Then the blind warrior nodded. "Very well. So glad you approve." As he retreated past her back the way he came, Halibel called over her shoulder. "Don't worry, Tisan. When we need you, you'll know it." He did not stop to bandy words with the hollow harlot. But something in the way she said that last unnerved him. An eerie prickle went up his spine, a premonition owing to a lifetime of recognizing imminent danger that could not be seen by the naked eye. So when he got back to his room, Kanem immediately crossed to a small cleared space he used for meditation. Seating himself, he rested Suzumushi upon his lap. Gloved hands rested lightly upon her. Blind eyes stared straight ahead unblinkingly. Now that he had a moment to think, was it possible he had merely been starting at shadows? Perhaps Halibel intended only to unsettle him, nothing more. Do I dare intrude upon my superiors in their most sacred communion? It was only thanks to the establishment of the Sankishi, or three precious children, that their world had been spared further unspeakable depredations. For several years after they were unjustly trapped in this dimension, all Nirvana had lived in terror of the Primera Espada, Coyote Stark. The Fenris ULF ran wild through this beautiful realm, slaughtering all he came across. Only the power of Lord Aizen could withstand him. Yet no matter how many times his master triumphed, he could not manage to destroy Stark permanently. Weakened, yes. But eventually, no matter what methods were brought to bear, the beast would regain its strength, and the madness started all over again. It was Anohana who fashioned the concept of the dreamless abyss in which Coyote Stark might be imprisoned anew. After her restoration, she, Aizen, and Halibel formed the Sankishi, a holy trinity meant to preserve their world. Only three beings of such unswerving might could serve to bind the beast deep in its prison, far removed from the poor suffering souls of Nirvana. There the monstrous hollow remained, trapped as surely as the day they found him on the moon. Anohana's restoration brought them deliverance, it could not be denied. Yet had they simply replaced one uncontrollable monster with another? Should one of them fall, or should the witch succumb to her malice, the formation will crumble, and we shall all perish in the jaws of the wolf. That will never happen. Lord Aizen has the situation firmly in hand. Poor Tisan, it is only a matter of time. You know this to be true. No. I must have faith. They are our saviors. They will never abandon us to the darkness. No? Prove it to me. I will. His mouth opened slightly, and a drawn-out breath emerged. Senses focused. All the sound around him went away, except for the spot he needed to hear, the heart of the palace, where even now, the Sankishi met to renew the binding that protected all their subjects. Susanoo, goddess of the ocean, spoke first. We've been able to transmit small things through me before. Only they weren't alive. For this to succeed, he would have to be a part of me. It will be done, God of the Moon. Tsukiyomi replied in reassured tones. It would mean restraining your hunger, possibly for months or years on end. We cannot be certain how long it would take. We no longer have years, Sosuke. Our time has come. The haunting tones of Amaterasu, goddess of the sun, made Tisan swallow nervously. It was all he could do to continue listening and not stop out of sheer fright. Grimjo approaches his apogee. And Rogero grows uncooperative. He must be brought to heel. Or dispatched altogether. I mislike the thought of wasting our resources, stretched thin as they are. It cannot be helped, Amaterasu growled low in her throat suddenly. His ulterior motives are plain as day. He thinks to use our creation to effect his own reign. And Grimjo, well. We never expected obedient cooperation. Tsukiyomi smiled when he spoke, evident in his tone. A king chafes at any yoke, especially one imposed by another ruler. Which is why we must have someone more tractable. A person who will obey their master without question. At this Tison swallowed. An uncomfortable suspicion had dawned upon him. Were they talking about? The preparations are complete. When you are ready, we can begin. You'll be gentle, Retsu? Reprisal at this stage would only hurt our fortunes. Your blind dog has nothing to fear, from me. An involuntary gasp almost cost him his focus. Hastily Tison sought to catch the rest of the conversation before it could fade and be lost. I'll be in my quarters, then. Here Susanoo chuckled hungrily in a way that was almost as disturbing as the witch and slithered upright, her clothing rustling. Bring him to me, and I'll taste my fill. I want to take my time with this meal. Only a nibble, Sosuke, she added when Tsukiyomi stirred in his seat. Just enough to bring him through. Then let us see to it. Here Susanoo took her leave. Tsukiyomi and Amaterasu conferred briefly for a time before she too departed. The meeting had ended. Which left only Tison. His heart nearly stopped. I know you're listening. Do not be ashamed. Come to me, and I will explain everything. It is time you knew the part you were born to play. The world around him came back so suddenly that Tison's head snapped to one side as though he had been struck. For a while he could only sit there trembling in confusion and fear. Then obediently, he stood and followed his master's orders. Poor Tison. Being the father of 2 children, Ichigo Kurosaki had plenty of experience with the zoo. And to be sure, back in his very young childhood, it was one of his top places to visit on Earth. Ah, the glow of innocence. Of course, to an adult, the thing that lingered in your mind most about the zoo was the smell. Animal hide, and lots of it. Hot garbage rotting in trash cans. Certain people who seemed to have an aversion to bathing. And of course, animal poop. A whole lot of animal poop. So if anyone were to ask him what he, a grown man with no visible children in tow, was doing in the zoo right now, it would not be an entirely unreasonable question. And his answer? He had come to speak to a ghost chaser. No entry. One of the security guards held up a hand to forestall him as he approached the gorilla habitat. The other one pointed at a freshly positioned sign that read, "Filming in progress, please do not disturb." Ichigo drew to a halt. Looking between them uncomfortably, he stated, "I'm a friend of Ishimurika's." Neither of them even blinked. Clearly this line had been tried before, with no success. And if you need to confirm that, then ask Mizuho Asano. Now that registered, judging by the way both men started violently. They withdrew a short distance to converse briefly before one of them pulled out a phone. Your name? He asked with barely concealed trepidation. So he told them. The push of a button, a quick conversation, some very abusive language, and Ichigo Kurosaki was permitted to stroll down the path like he owned the place. His destination proved easy to spot with the naked eye alone. Just follow the lights of the TV cameras. In no time he found himself mixing with a diverse assembly of gophers, cameramen, set technicians, sound pros, caterers, and what looked like half a dozen guys in suits arguing volubly with a sanguine old fellow slouching in a director's chair pointedly ignoring their criticism. Wearing his own off-the-rack power suit made Ichigros look like one of those TV executives, which could explain why nobody remarked on his presence. Some of the younger executive producer types had dyed their hair fantastic colors, which made Ichigo feel like a tiger hidden amongst painted zebra. This was certainly the place for it, after all. Spiritual senses helped him home in on his target. Walking over to a small pavilion, the Shinigami substitute called out, "Hey! Riki!" The monk sitting cross-legged before the mandrill exhibit swiveled swiftly around. Ichigo. Ishimurika swiftly came to his feet and strode over, grinning broadly. He extended a hand which Kurosaki accepted immediately, and the 2 former delinquents grinned while clapping one another on the shoulder. Several television folk passing by observed their star's exuberance with a measure of surprise. They knew him as a serene, detached soul who walked calmly through life with a purpose most of them could only envy. But right now he looked like what he was, a young man Ichigo's age with shaved head in the robes of a Shinto priest. Breaking off a bit, the Shinigami substitute smiled at his old enemy. You look good, man. And you look like a suit. It was said in a derisive tone, but the beaming grin that twisted those homely features told there was no real malice behind Rika's words. And trust me, I've met a lot of them by now. So what Asano-sama said was true, huh? You took a job with the government. The husky monk shook his head and chuckled good-naturedly. Local government. For some reason Ichigo felt it necessary to clarify this to everyone. Yeah. That's what she said. So, Kirishima bent closer, and his voice dropped an octave. Misato-sensei. The tall redhead seemed to scrunch in on himself like a turtle ducking into its shell, hands digging deep inside his pockets and glancing about uncomfortably. Yeah. Leaving the Zoemitsu dojo had been hard, but necessary. He wasn't about to be a burden to Shikamato-sensei. His name could no longer be considered a draw in the kendo community, so that made him just an unnecessary drain on her already tight resources. They still kept in touch, and sometimes he dropped by to oversee a class. All free, of course. After all, he was a salaryman now. All thanks to their generous and severely deranged governor, Misato Oki, who still ruled their province with an iron fist. Being part of the public sector, Ichigo was more familiar with the bizarre goings-on that held sway in government ward offices than your average citizen. At least, in this province. Governor Oki had started small, with mandatory group exercise breaks that all public sector employees had to observe. To maintain physical fitness, she had told them. Which was fine on its face. But then came the target practice, using slings to lob metal balls the size of kiwi fruit at pictures of large skull-faced monsters of all shapes and sizes. Coordinated mob attacks of stuffed demons where you were urged to go for the eyes and try and tear off their masks. Escaping from invisible demons who tracked you by unknown means and could walk through walls. Those who knew him might think such training was right up Ichigo's alley. But he understood the real reason behind all Governor Oka's craziness. And he found it worrying. I'm glad you could make it, man, Rika suddenly spoke. Why didn't you bring the kids? Too spooky. No, actually. They're big fans. Ichigo decided to bite the bullet. This is about my son. Rika's cheerful features cleared, becoming totally serious. Tell me more. And he drew them both over to a private pavilion reserved for the star of the show. All around them, preparations for the next episode were well underway. A few years back, it had looked like low ratings and shifting trends spelled certain doom for poor Don Kanonji's underfunded and overhyped show. Ghosts and hauntings were out. People were more interested in miracles, like the so-called King's Touch, now once again popularly referred to as the miracle cure. So when a local media station reported that numerous examples of the miracle appeared to occur in close proximity to Rika's temple, it didn't take long for the public's attention to focus there. As it happened, Oshima Rika had been quietly building a base of public support by way of his spiritual interventions. He helped folks suffering from hauntings with remarkable success. Those who visited him claiming to be pursued by apparitions or living under the constant scrutiny of lingering spirits quite often left with a newfound sense of peace and freedom. And unlike with most paranormal hucksters and psychic charlatans, this condition persisted. Most of them didn't know what he had done to help them. Oshima appeared to reason with the spirits at first. From there he performed a ritual which seemed to lift any supernatural malaise the victim was suffering under. This combined with the miracle led to Japan's sensation-hungry public demanding more. Q. Megumi Asano. Since graduating from Hokkaido University at the top of her class, Kigo Asano's unstoppable older sister went into show business, building her own talent agency that represented numerous rising stars in both film, athletics, and the arts. Tatsuki Arisawa and Konpaku Shiba numbered among her clients. And those were just the beginning. When word reached her of the hubbub in Karakura town, Megumi wasted no time and used her personal connections to swoop in, seizing upon the unwitting Oshima like an eagle snatching up a rabbit. After getting as much of an understanding of the situation as she was likely to, and being pulled off from fondling his bald head, the eager agent proceeded to bring Don Kanonji and Rika together, fusing their different styles into a Frankenstein's monster of a program that combined spiritual intervention, ghost sightings, and entertainment. The result? Monk's Lonely Ghost Journey featuring Don Kanonji. So that's the deal. Ichigo's explanation was finished. In the fold-out chair across from him, Reiki had adopted a cross-legged pose once more, hunched over with 2 fingers pressed together against his lips. Brow furrowed, he stared at the ground for a while, then looked up. "Ichigo, I'm touched you turned to me about this. But in all honesty, I don't think I'm the guy to help here. No matter what you might have heard, I'm still just a novice. My spiritual journey is far from complete. Have you tried your friends in the afterlife?" "Well." He took a sip of high-quality bottled water and scratched his cheek uncomfortably. "See, thing is, Rukia's still technically on probation as a Shinigami. Her captain, who's head of the healing division, has given them checkups but can't find anything wrong. And Rukia doesn't really trust anyone else sufficiently to let them near our kids." The mere thought of Mayuri Kuratsuke, or even Urahara, examining his children sent a cold shiver through Ichigo's innards, so he kind of knew where she was coming from. But Rukia did not share his concerns about Kyojaku's dream episodes, which were growing more frequent. Hence his attempt to reach out to less obvious candidates for help. Although an idea appeared to have dawned, and now Reika leaned forward all smiles again. "Your coming here might not have been a wasted trip. I think I know someone who could be much greater help in this situation. If you say Don Kanonji." "No. Don't be an idiot." Clearly the celebrity monk did not hold his co-star in high regard. "I meant my guardians." "Oh." Now Ichigo could see what he was hinting at. It was the secret behind Ishima's success in terms of spiritual interventions. Ever since the day Kyojaku was born, when the Wild Hunt attacked Karakura town, Reiki had forged a sort of bond with 2 of the Arashi clan mages who helped defend them, the Misho, or demon generals. The details weren't clear, but somehow they considered him an ally during that conflict, and had received permission from their lord to keep an eye on the devoted if somewhat misguided monk and his mission to bring peace to wayward souls throughout Japan. It was these eccentric Shinigami who used their magic all unseen to purify any plus spirits who might cross Reika's path. He believed them to be some type of bodhisattva or Shinto gods, which wasn't too far off the mark. Either the Misho didn't bother to correct him on it or gave up trying long ago. But whether you could see them or not, those 2 mages often accompanied Ishima on his lonely trek, and should his prayers and attempts to reason with the spirit failed, they wasted no time in performing kinso and sending the departed to Soul Society where they belonged. Reika could often get to the bottom of what might be chaining ghosts to the places and people they haunted, but it was the Arashi who executed the final act utilizing their own unique brand of sorcery. And that might be just what he needed. "Ishima," Ichigo said, a smile starting to creep up his face. "You might be onto something there." While inspecting a wall scroll of a tiger hidden in a bamboo forest, Toshiro heard the door of the waiting room slide open. He turned about ready to greet his host, only to receive a shock. "Your ladyship." Captain Hitsugaya. Tall and commanding, Lady Kyokaku of the Arashi came stomping in like a tank. Crimson and green robes of exquisite design swathed her frame like only tailor-made clothing could. But true to her nature, the former head of the Shiba clan managed to look disheveled all the same, with one sleeve constantly threatening to slip off her good shoulder and wild hair bursting from the pins and clasps doing their utmost to keep that bird's nest in shape. The tiger lady stood proud before him nonetheless as only a born noble could. Fierce, self-assured, and very, very pregnant. Kyokaku entered flanked by several female attendants. Some carried platters of foodstuffs, others fans and pillows, all moving around their mistress like electrons orbiting a nucleus. When she moved, they reciprocated, preserving the distance between them as they waited upon their mistress' whims. The servants looked more comfortable with this arrangement than their employer, who apparently still hadn't grown quite accustomed to being waited on hand and foot. Pronounced discomfort in her face and bearing reminded Toshiro why this meeting was such a surprise. "Sorry for the intrusion," and he offered a deep bow. "It wasn't my intention to disturb you in your convalescence, I had hoped to speak to your husband." "He's busy." Kyokaku drew to a halt right in front of him with hand on her hip, glowering down. "So what can I do for you?" The swell of her belly was level with the small warrior's head, and he had to force himself not to stare, but it was so damn much. "All right at eye level." Kyokaku and her posse all seemed to be regarding him with the exact same question in their eyes, "What do you want?" "What now?" You could beg off and come back at a later date. But wouldn't doing so at this stage only make things worse? You've already dragged the lady all the way here, son. Point taken. I was hoping to have a look at something in the Arashi archives on Zanpakuto. Fine. Kyokaku reached out and swiped a slice of honeydew off a platter, biting into it with a crunch. She then spun around, swaying a bit to get her balance, and marched off. Follow me. Toshiro hadn't expected so little resistance to his admittedly out-of-nowhere entreaty. He had to hustle to keep up with the brisk pace she set. Perhaps Kyokaku was determined to show everyone not even pregnancy could slow her down. After the announcement had been made, little more information regarding her condition could be called public knowledge. The Arashi still maintained a level of secrecy about their internal workings despite becoming more closely aligned with the Godi 7 these past few years. Still, it unnerved him a little to be in this place. Even with relations between this house and the Godi 7 as they were, the presence of so many of their own armed forces, the Misho, served to remind him that the Arashi still maintained a very separate existence from the rest of the Shirai, both militarily and socially. After passing through sharply curving corridors and halls that could host an entire division, they reached a set of double doors to enter a relatively small chamber. The otherwise unadorned floor boasted a large hexagonal stone slab. 6 Arashi mages stood arrayed around it, and as their party took up position upon the slab, they began to chant. Runes in the floor glowed green, and the whole thing slowly began to rise into the air, taking them with it. At a certain point, magic prickled over his skin, ancient and purposeful. Next thing he knew, Toshiro found them rising into a tremendous library of sorts, row upon row of wooden shelves ringing them like a forest. As their transport drew level with the floor, it settled in as naturally as could be. Peering about at this arcane sanctum, the captain couldn't help but feel a little odd. Herein was housed the most comprehensive collection on Shinigami and their corresponding guardian spirits in existence. The Grand Library of the Shinigami Academy, and even the old Central 46 archives, could not compare to this assemblage of knowledge. And it was only one of many maintained by the Arashi clan since before the foundation of the Shirai itself. A captain could spend his long lifetime here and still not peruse even a fraction of the contents. I need to sit down, Kyokaku abruptly announced. No, not here, damn it. She groused as several piles of cushions materialized at her feet. The lady of the manor gave a slightly embarrassed look at her young guest. The archivists will help you find whatever you're looking for. Come find me when you're done. And with that she marched off, taking her obedient assembly with her. How may we help you, sir? A robed librarian had stolen upon him so quietly Toshiro almost gave a start. With no outward sign of this, he turned to regard the man. I would like to know about Sogyo no Kotori, specifically its known wielders in the past. With an adroit bow the librarian set off, and the captain followed. A constant clacking noise filled the air, like wooden discs in an abacus dropping against each other. As they walked Toshiro noticed how the archives held no actual books or scrolls. Instead large wooden tablets or talismans took up space amongst the shelving. The archivists operated wheels set on the ends of the shelves which called up text and images on rolls of paper attached above them. I wonder how much information those things can actually contain. This place seems to go on forever. Is it really all just about soul cutters and their history? At last they came to one row in particular. His guide inserted a key into the side of the stacks, then proceeded to turn the prayer wheels. In only a few seconds, a very familiar sword appeared on the paper screen. We look better in real life. I'm told the camera adds 10 pounds. See how much weight you put on by doubling up, then come talk to us, Ice Meister. A brief and remarkably easy explanation on how to operate the controls followed, at which point the librarian left him to his business. Despite there being no one else around, Hitsugaya couldn't shake the feeling that he was under surveillance. The Arashi were very protective of their treasures, as he had cause to know. Doubtless sentries were on guard here at all times out of open view. Might as well get started. In no time he had mastered the setup and was flipping through registries. The names and even faces of Sogyo no Kotori's previous Shinigami came up readily enough, first and foremost being the most recent, Jushiro Yukatake, that anyone else knew of, that is. Even in his drawing, The man had a smile on, which would have made Toshiro do the same had their relationship not been made known to him. He quickly cycled back through the generations of wielders. According to this, Sogyo no Kotori had manifested only half a dozen times before the start of the Godai 13, when it became Jushiro's steadfast partner up to the day Unoha Naretsu severed their bond permanently. Despite this, every single person who wielded her up till then was counted among the most powerful of their generation, comparable to present-day captains. Detailed biographical information was included, and in some cases they even had pictures from youth to old age. But none of them proved to be what he sought. Toshiro. After several minutes of fruitless searching, he stepped back in frustration. Excuse me. Yes, sir. Once again the librarian snuck up on him without Toshiro noticing. He had to give the man credit. Even Stealth Forces operatives couldn't move so stealthily. Can you show me the records concerning my own sword, Hirin Meru? Certainly. Another trip through the dimly lit library followed. Once arriving at the right spot, the librarian again gave him his privacy, and the white-haired searcher plumbed the depths of knowledge held in store here. History unfurled before him like a movie in the mortal realm. More faces and names appeared. And still, the end result remained the same. A turn of the wheel left the paper screen before him blank. Gazing at its clean white surface, Toshiro Hitsugaya slid down and sat heavily on the floor. Swiveling around, he leaned against the wooden stacks and let his head rest back against them with a frustrated groan. Kid? You all right there? He did not answer. We could have told you this wouldn't work. The lady you met wasn't one of our previous wielders. Nor mine, Toshiro. His chin came up, tired eyes drifting around the chamber. Then who is she? It was unusual for a Shinigami to speak out loud during a conversation with their Zanpakuto. This as much as anything told the double dragon swords how seriously recent developments had affected him. The recognition that he might soon lose his mother forever had spurred Hitsugaya to suddenly seek out information regarding the woman he briefly met after his murder at the hands of Jinichi Maru, when he acquired control of Sogyo no Kotori. Which had led them here. Some things are beyond the ken of even we Zanpakuto. There is much afoot in the world, especially concerning the people around you. It's hard to lose a parent. They've been in your life since it began. And to learn Shirabe was your mother the whole time, well, that coupled with the truth about Ju-chan would knock anyone for a loop. A soft burst of laughter escaped his lips. Ju-chan. It's what we called him. Always made the guy smile. I just want to know, okay? I'm sick of not knowing, and only finding out after it's too late to do anything about it. Both soul cutters felt relieved at their private conversation resuming. Granny. I mean, Shirabe's going to die. And there's nothing I can do to stop it. She'll be gone, and I'll be with her so she's not alone, but after that, there'll be no more chances. I'll never get to see her smile at me again, or given when she insists I take something to eat before I leave, or hug me and tell me she loves me. And the only reason I even have the chance to be with her now is because of what that woman did. She brought me back after Jin killed me. So I'd like to know more about her. Because when someone's gone, you never get the chance to ask them anything again. And there's still so much I don't know about my real mother. Or father, for that matter. For once, his inner spirits did not respond. Sorry, I didn't mean to bring you both down. It's fine, you know? At the very least, one good thing's come out of this. I know it's crazy to even think it, but, in a way, I'm relieved that Granny is going before me. If I died before she did. I mean, it might kill her, you know. Now she'll die hoping that my life will go on for a good long while. That's what always bothered me, that if I did die out in the field, then she'd get some kind of letter from Leopard Division informing her that. Toshiro, there is something you must know. The tone in Hirin Meru's voice made him sit up and take notice. What? The life you were given that day, will not last forever. A shiver went down the ice mage's spine upon hearing it. How do you mean? It was not meant for you. It cannot sustain you indefinitely. The wound left in your heart by Shinso cannot be repaired. And when your time is up. He blinked several times. You're saying I'm going to die again? Yes. I am SOR. When? I cannot be sure. Damn you. Give me a straight answer already, will you? His fist struck the floor with a resounding smack. All around him, the sound of clicking tablets became overwhelming. Like a dirge of insects. Or grains of sand slipping through an hourglass. The darkened library seemed to swirl before his eyes, becoming blurry and distorted, like sliding into the embrace of death once more. All over again he felt the razor-sharp dagger piercing his heart to come bursting out of his chest, heard Matsumoto scream his name. Tears slid down his cheeks. My family, we all die. There is still time and life left to you. Please do not fall into despair. We both have a destiny to fulfill. I could not bear to fail after all this. Fail? Fail? What the hell are you talking about? I am. Overhead, there suddenly came a whirring of the wheels. Toshiro glanced up in confusion. Had the librarian snuck up on him again? But when he looked, no one was there. What are you doing? Tell him. This is not your decision to make. He can't take any more secrets. Just tell him, already. Yo, Snowflake. You alright? Down the lane, Kyokaku and her entourage were approaching. One of the staff must have warned her when he started getting volatile. The Lady of Arashi drew up beside him. When the boy stood, uncertain what to say, her sharp black eyes went to the paper screen behind him. Abruptly, they softened. One hand stole over her protruding stomach protectively. Oh. I get it. Must be kinda traumatic to see that. Hitsugaya turned around to see what she meant, and found himself face to face with Aizen Sosuke. It took only a moment to realize this was only a picture of the man. But in that instant, he remembered all over again, the pain of being cut down in the underground archives by the rebel captain's weapon, slaughtered without effort and bleeding out on the floor. Just like with Jin. Beside Aizen's drawing was something more, a picture of his sword, Kyoka Suijutsu. Toshiro found himself entranced by that innocuous blade. Almost as if it held him in its hypnotic spell again. Deep within his soul, Hirin Maru growled. When the Leopard Company captain made no move for a while, Kyokaku reached a decision. Think we better get going. Being in this place too long can make you buggy. She tapped him on the shoulder, and when he finally looked at her, the shaggy-haired noblewoman hiked a thumb over her shoulder. Come on. Katsura will want to say hi. He gave a dumb nod, and proceeded to follow her out of the hall. Upon leaving the library storage dimension, his host led him into the mansion proper. Hitsugaya remained quiet the whole time. Kyokaku noted his silence with a measure of concern. Her brother Kon had once mentioned something about this kid, but he had become evasive when she pressed for details and took off soon after. Had she not been pregnant at the time, Kyokaku would have given pursuit and twisted some answers out of him. Right now she resolved to redress that lapse at the first available opportunity. The kid seemed downright off. But that would have to wait. Her hubby had his duties to fulfill. And so she led him to a small ritual chamber where they found Katsura Arashi, Lord of Tigers, sitting in front of a family shrine deep in prayer. Sticks of incense burned in bowls of sand while artfully drawn portraits of deceased family members stared in dutiful consideration from lacquered frames. When Kyokaku uttered a discreet if less than genteel cough, her husband perked up. Ah! Katsura then slid gracefully to his feet in a single motion, a display of fitness that both pleased and aroused his wife. Late-stage pregnancy was proving to be more of an emotional roller coaster than she would ever have believed. Suppressing an urge to jump him right then and there, she settled for announcing, Captain Hitsugaya of Leopard Company, here to see us. I trust you will forgive my lapse in greeting you, Teiku. Katsura offered a faint smile to his beloved as he approached. I had family obligations to observe. But my enchanting wife no doubt saw to your needs admirably. He took her arm then, causing Kyokaku to scowl and look away in an attempt to hide a blush that fooled no one. Giving her hand a kiss, he turned easy eyes upon the small soldier. I trust you found what you were looking for. Not exactly, Hitsugaya mumbled back, feeling a bit overwhelmed by his own drama and the overt example of blissfully married couple on display. Apparently his inner turmoil did not miss the Tiger Lord's keen eye, for Katsura tilted his head up higher. Might we offer you refreshments? It is almost time for dinner, and we would be glad to have your company. Dining alone can be such a bleak prospect, after all, he added when Toshiro seemed about to refuse on instinct. Taken aback by this assertive authority, the boy captain found himself nodding in agreement. Splendid. The ruling couple swept by him then. Toshiro was just turning to follow. In doing so, though, he got his first good look at the ceremonial altar that dominated this room. His heart leapt up into his throat at what he saw there. On the cusp of leaving, Katsura felt strong fingers dig into his arm. He turned a questioning look on his wife, who was looking back over her shoulder. When he did the same, Lord Arashi found their young guest had gone stock still, almost frozen in place. Captain Hitsugaya? He asked gently. Is aught amiss? After a moment, Toshiro's head slowly swiveled around. The look on his face was completely lost, as if he didn't know where he was. But before anyone could comment on this, one arm lifted, and he pointed at a picture on the altar. Who is that? Katsura looked where indicated. Those bright eyes narrowed slightly, and he responded in somewhat begrudging tones, that is my younger sister, Manami. Manami. Takiyaku. Yes. At a subtle signal from their master, servants moved in and extinguished the incense sticks before closing the doors of the cabinet, cutting off all view of what lay within. Will you accompany us now, Captain? Some food will no doubt do you good. Yes. Hitsugaya joined them. The party proceeded towards one of the dining rooms in the Arashi complex. No words were spoken between them along the way. At least, none aloud. Higher in Meru? Silence at first. Then. Yes? It was painful to ask. Literally. Phantom pain ached in both his back and his heart. But after what he had seen today, there was no way he could live without knowing. Who was your last master? My last master. There was too much distress from the Zanpakuto's end to go on. So Toshiro had time to think. The Takiyaku clan. Katsura Arashi's sister, Manami. And her youngest child, Aizen, no, Takiyaku Sosuke. Not the youngest, we're sorry to say. In between one step and the next, Toshiro went to his inner world. The desolate plain swept out before him, buried beneath an age's worth of ice. When he looked up, higher in Meru hung in the sky, great wings flapping slowly to keep him aloft. Around him now curled the twin dragons, Sogyo no Kotori. And in the center of his own Zanpakuto's icy chest, there was the silhouette of a seated figure. A woman. Toshiro could not bring himself to ask, and higher in Meru could not bring himself to begin. So it fell to Sogyo no Kotori to take over. We knew who she was, of course. How could we not? She died right in front of us, fighting to protect her children. The boy Sosuke was dead, or so we all thought. But when Captain Shiba cut that poor woman's head off, it ended more than one life. Because as it turns out, she was pregnant. Toshiro knew this story by now. At the King of Soul Society's command, the Goti I-13 exterminated the Takiyaku clan for their role in the Manor Wars. But before they could, Anoha Naretsu took advantage of this travesty to spirit Sosuke Takiyaku to safety, promising to keep him safe and avenge the loss of his family. Katsura Arashi withdrew his clan from all Shinigami activities in protest, and the Shiba were brought to ruin by his age-old machinations, a tale of vengeance that ended only when Shiba's own daughter married the very man who slew her father. And unbeknownst to all of them, Aizen Sosuke returned centuries later to pay off all old debts. Toshiro's eyes closed as he remembered the words that were spoken to him as he lay dying. With eyes that never saw. With ears that never heard. With a mouth that never spoke. With hands that never touched. Never allowed to live. Murdered with his mother in the womb. Only a heart, beating. All this I give to you. With a mother's love. He looked at the shadowy maiden frozen in the center of Higher in Meru. It looked as though her hands were clasped protectively over her stomach, the same way Kyokaku had before, almost instinctively. So, that is the life I was given. Toshiro Hitsugaya came back to reality without missing a beat. They walked along the halls of Arashi Manor. For a while even his inner voices were subdued. And then, Toshiro. I'm here. My last master was Takiyaku Sosuke. Several people around Hitsugaya felt a chill settle over them right then. You were Aizen's Zanpakuto. Yes. How? I was with him. From birth. My first master in centuries. I was called to him. And then, one night, his whole family died. Yes. He was taken by a witch. And she performed a blasphemous rite upon him, stealing the souls of his slain kin, and sealing them within him to give rise to something unnatural. A force of power, deception, and vengeance, bound by blood to his very soul. That monstrosity took root in him. And it forced me out. For centuries I waited, bereft. Until the day you were born. And now? Now I seek to see him freed. I must destroy the king of deceit, who keeps him bound in lies and promises vile. This hateful beast haunts his blood, and will continue to do so through his line for ages to come, passed down from parent to child. Unless it is destroyed. That is the reason I came to you, Toshiro. That is our destiny. I see. There was so much more that needed to be said between them. But at that moment, a door swept open, and Toshiro was assailed by the warm scents of spices, roasting meat, and grilled vegetables. Thank you for joining our family for dinner, Captain Hitsugaya. Katsura Arashi spoke from his place by a table bearing all manner of delectable and exquisitely prepared repast. Standing in the doorway, Hitsugaya watched as Kyokako lowered herself down with the assistance of her husband, grousing all the while but seemingly resolved to accept this level of mother-henning on his part. They spoke softly to each other, and for a moment the boy felt out of place, an illegitimate child, raised in seclusion and without a shred of social grace. What right did he have to intrude on this? But then a servant offered to lead him to his seat. And Hitsugaya again smelled the aroma of hot food, felt the tender affection of a family at mealtime. These things he had long experience with. It was his birthright as much as anyone's. So he took his place, and enjoyed himself greatly. Hey, Kon. Ichigo. It's been a while. What's up? I wanted to ask if you could stop by today. It's about my kids. What? Don't worry, I'm not asking you to babysit while Rukia and I go on a date. She's not here, actually. Oh. She's in Seoul Society on business. Which is partly why we need to do this today. You know I'm not exactly close by, right? You could be halfway across the world and get here in 10 minutes, the way you run. Har har. And it's closer to 8. Really? Wild. Look, I don't want to go into details over the phone, but I've got some of Arashi's people stopping by to have a look at the Munchkins, and I wanted someone I can trust to keep these guys in line if they start getting, uncooperative. Still don't see what that has to do with me. You're the brother of their lord and master's wife. Adopted? That doesn't mean the same thing to them as it does you and me. As far as those guys are concerned, you're like a god. One word in Kyokaku's ear and they're swinging from the gallows. See what I'm saying? I guess. So you'll do it? Yeah. Awesome. Give me a ring when you've crossed the Atlantic, or whatever. Bye. Bye. Kon hung up the phone. He closed his eyes, and shuddered. A hand came down on his shoulder. Well, ain't that interesting, Junichi Maru sneered. Kurosaki-kun. Kurosaki-kun. Kyojaku awoke with his head cradled on a desk. He sat up and looked around to find the entire class staring at him, some with grins on their faces, others decidedly less amused. Their teacher was one of the latter. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, the middle school student offered a sheepish smile. Sorry, he mumbled. See me after class, their homeroom teacher stated. With a pointed glare, he then turned back to the chalkboard. A few people chuckled, as they had long experience with his behavior. Narcolepsy was a word that had been a part of their vocabulary for a long time. Heaving a sigh, he went back to daytime matters. Pity, that had been a good one. The rest of the school day passed uneventfully. Kyojaku had lunch with his friends, where they chatted about upcoming exams and the latest gossip. Whenever he felt himself drifting, the middle schooler snapped himself back to reality. Dreams were interesting, but he had a life to be getting on with, and one could not be ignored in favor of the other. Time seemed to drag on until late afternoon. It was torture not to look at the clock every few minutes in hopes of finding it might be later than he hoped. But soon enough, the bell rang, and they were all free. Having no club activities today, Kyojaku made his goodbyes at the school gates, where he was sure to find someone waiting. Sure enough, she had arrived before him. "Pick up the pace," Hiroko Kurosaki scolded her elder brother. Wearing the uniform of a different school, she left off leaning against the wall surrounding the yard and took up step beside him. "It's not a race," he responded with a smile, satchel draped over his shoulder as he began the lazy walk back home. "Lucky for you." That was true enough. Hiroko had inherited the genes for athleticism in the family. She probably ran here all the way here, but looked no more out of breath than if they went to school next door to each other. Life just didn't seem fair sometimes. For most of his life, Shotoku Kyojaku Kurosaki had not been the most athletically talented individual. Hiroko insisted it was because he spent so much time asleep, while he retorted that it gave him an advantage in terms of height. That remained true to this day, although by the look of it, his sister might soon overtake him there as well. Hiroko had hit her growth spurt recently, and was starting to shoot up. Her painstakingly maintained hair now hovered just below his nose. Was it crazy to think she might get taller than him? Not a comforting thought for her big brother. "So I think I saw a ghost today," his younger sibling suddenly exclaimed as they went past other preteens on their way home. "Is that right? What did it look like?" "I didn't really get a good look. It was, you know." She waved a hand quickly in front of her face. "Out of the corner of my eye. But I definitely saw something." "Right, Kuko." "Oh, cork it," she grumbled back, tugging at one of the hairbands that kept her untidy mane in a bare semblance of twin tails. The potential onset of puberty had done nothing to tame her perpetual bedhead. Yet another burden the younger Kurosaki labored under in addition to not being spiritually sensitive. Her lack of ghostly perception was a lifelong topic in their family. Hiroko had long expressed hope that, becoming a woman, as she put it, might awaken any latent abilities in that regard. He had never dissuaded her from this hope, even if he himself didn't share it. "But it doesn't matter anyway," Hiroko suddenly stated. "Get a load of this. Ta-da!" And she pulled something from her satchel with a triumphant grin. Early birthday present. Kyojaku had no trouble recognizing the Jikangan tubes their parents used to switch from soul to flesh. Anyone else would mistake it for an ordinary Pez dispenser. "Tell me you didn't." He sighed. "Not yet." And she pocketed her prize once more. "I'm waiting for a special occasion. Kaa-san will kill you if she finds out you pinched that." "What?" His sister grumbled defensively. "My birthday is coming up, and Mom said I could choose one thing from the store for free." "She didn't mean that, and you know it." "Whatever. Just don't tell, okay?" "Hiroko, you're such a bad liar, you'll never be able to hide it." That was certainly true. His sister's innate tendency to get into trouble was melded with an inability to come up with excuses better than, "I didn't do it," or, "I don't remember." By now the crowd had thinned, and they found themselves walking alone. The topic of the upcoming festival arose, and when their aunts might come for a visit. Both were at university, but they made time to visit. Another potential source of excitement was what their father had mentioned recently. "Do you really think we could meet Monkishima in person?" Hiroko asked. "Maybe. They're filming around here," Kyojaku stated with assurance, bringing out his smartphone to refresh his memory. Anything not related to Dream Info tended to slip his mind, a habit he found annoying while his parents remained more troubled. "If we do go, Jaku, I think we're being followed." This comment took him completely by surprise. Rounding on his sister, he found she had come to a halt and was glaring back down the street along which they walked. But no one was in sight. Of course, this didn't necessarily mean anything. The older Kurosaki closed his eyes and breathed deeply, allowing his innate spiritual senses to sharpen. Though nowhere near the level of power possessed by their father, Kyojaku could still detect noteworthy spectral entities when close by. And he was particularly sensitive to hollows, a trait he had possessed since birth. Even the slightest trace of those monsters caused his skin to prickle in premonition. Now, however, no such reaction took place. "There's nothing spooky," he informed her. "Are you sure?" Rather than responding, Hiroko took off at a run. In no time she had reached the wall that bounded this stretch of residential housing and peered around the corner. He saw her eyes narrow in frustration, and she quickly rejoined him. "They split," she groused, jamming a hand into her skirt pocket. With the danger past, her belligerence served only to amuse him. "Were you hoping to have a street fight?" he teased. "No," she shot back while fishing around for gum. "But if they hadn't run, I would have." Here Hiroko stopped and spun around. "They're back." This was getting irritating. "Kuko, is this another ghost feeling? I didn't hear anything, or feel anything, so if you are not being serious." Before he could finish, his little sister took a deep breath and screamed the way only girls can. "Rape." Astonished, Kyojaku could only stare. Yet right when he was wondering if something might be wrong with her, there came a slight whoosh of displaced air. And just like that, they weren't alone anymore. "Shit." Hiroko crossed her arms smugly. Brother and sister regarded the newcomer, who watched them right back. He was tall, dressed in an orange tracksuit with an Olympic logo on it, and the running shoes he had on were of a brand that could have paid a month's rent on their family store by the look of them. His head was shaved down to a light stubble, while his face bore a somewhat cat-like quality, with a pointed chin and huge bright blue eyes. This odd figure stood frozen in an awkward crouched position, as though uncertain whether he should bolt or not. Right then something dawned on Kyojaku. While Hiroko had taken up a protective stance beside him, he stepped past his warding sister to ask, "Are you Kon?" Those oddly exaggerated eyes darted between them. At last the man's shoulders slumped, and he rubbed the back of his head with a glum expression. "Yeah." The teen nodded thoughtfully. Their father's friend Tatsuki, another professional athlete, had shown them a photo of the two of them together in her wallet. This was Konpaku Shiba, their father's friend, an Olympic champion and a sort of refugee from Seoul society. "Why were you following us?" his sister suddenly demanded. Kon grimaced, noting how several people had come out of their homes to investigate that shout. "Look, can we please move away from here first before somebody calls the cops on me?" Brother and sister looked at one another and gave identical shrugs. They then moved to either side of the lanky track star, and the three set off together. Once they had gone a safe distance, Kon started talking. "Your dad called. He said he's bringing in some folks from Seoul society to give you kids a checkup, and I sort of have some influence with these guys. I guess you can say I'm supposed to make sure things don't get out of hand. So here I am. How come we never met you before?" Hiroko demanded with the blunt assurance of a preteen. The older man didn't look at her when he responded. "I'm kind of famous. It would draw too much attention if I started popping in, and your family doesn't need that. Tatsuki-san is famous too. That came from Kyojaku. And she stops by a lot. So is Ishida-sensei, and her husband, and... Yeah, you've got a lot of celebrities in your group, I get it." Stuffing his hands in his pockets, Kon marched along the street a little faster, such that they had to quicken their pace to keep up. Kyojaku wasn't sure why this person seemed so uncomfortable around them. Both their aunts and father had mentioned him before, to be sure. But this was the first time they ever met. Could there be something more to his story that caused him to keep his distance for so long? Maybe I can find the answer in dreams. But first things first. Shiba-sama. The mod soul turned to find that the boy had stopped in his tracks. Soon enough his sister noticed and followed suit. As Kon watched, Kyojaku straightened up with hands clasped to his sides and stated, "I am Shotoku Kurosaki, and this is my sister Hiroko." "Hey," the girl offered him a perfunctory wave. "Thank you for agreeing to look after us. We are in your care." And with that the kid bowed low enough to make any man feel like an emperor. Kon winced, bit his lip and finally came back with, "Same here. Nice to. I mean, you're welcome." He then set off towards the Usagi Shoten trailing the two kids, who proceeded to bombard him with questions the whole time. By the time she took her leave, Rukia felt that Yoshi was as ready as he could ever be to face his new home. It would be hard for him to go, that much seemed clear. But at least there was a support community waiting for him. She bid him goodbye at the door of his house. The haggard spirit managed a wan smile in return, peering anxiously about the empty neighborhood as he shut himself securely in once again. Rukia shook her head sadly before starting off down the empty lane. Not a sound came from the whitewashed domiciles that lined this street, boasting small flower patches with trees dotting the landscape. The streets were still well maintained and everything stayed as clean as when this was a bustling community housing hundreds of thousands of souls. But everyone else had gone to their last reward, living contentedly in a new spiritual plane of their choice. All but the last holdout. It made her somewhat disconsolate to see that Yoshi still couldn't accept there was no one about to hurt him, even after living in peace for over a decade. But then, he had been without even a measure of hope or security for untold years on the streets of the Rukanga, hounded night and day by fear of what might claim him. This after having known the comfort and security of the Siriti for so long. Remember how shocked we were when he first admitted to being a Shinigami? Yes. It was mind-boggling. What could warrant being stripped of his powers like that out of the blue? He's never told us, and honestly, I don't think even he knows. It just happened one day. After that his life as a death god was over. I just wish I could do more for him. He has his own path to walk. It can't be easy, losing a part of yourself like that. Remember how mopey you were after Ichigo took all your powers that night? Yes, so no Shirayuki, it was very traumatic, thank you for reminding me. Not like I was having a peachy time of it either, sweetheart. Just remember Lady Kukaki. Rukia drew up with a start upon realizing she was not alone. Her walk had taken her back to the main gate leading out of this halo. And standing next to the huge white arch was none other than Saijin Komamura. Komamura Dano, she greeted the dog-headed spirit. What a surprise. Are you here to see me? Yes. That huge form towered over the tiny death god as she drew up before him. There was no hint of menace, however. They were old friends, after all. In fact, Komamura appeared a trifle worried, if she had learned to read his admittedly alien facial features correctly. I inquired of some old acquaintances in your division, and they told me where to find you. Only officially reinstated a few hours and already people were keeping tabs on her. The joys of being a Kukaki. Brushing such concerns aside, she strove to put on a more welcome air. I gather this isn't just a social call. How may I be of service to you? His shaggy head looked off to one side. Large hands fisted in the fabric of his quality kimono which encircled his broad frame. At last he said, I wished to speak to you on a somewhat delicate situation I find myself in. For the past few days, or rather, for some time now, I have suspected that. He chewed over something in his mind for a while. Just as she was opening her mouth to inquire further, Saijin looked at her and said, it would appear that Captain Adolschvank is pregnant. Kukaki decorum went right out the window, and Rukia found herself gaping at him with a positively stunned expression. Her already large eyes looked to have grown to twice their previous size. Did he just say? Nell's pregnant? Yes. Nell. Neliel to Adolschvank. The hollow. Well, Aaron Carr, actually. Whatever. This can't be right, can it? Hollows. I mean, Aaron Carr, whatever, they can't get pregnant, can they? Her internal conversation wasn't going anywhere, so Rukia decided to focus on more productive avenues of discussion. With an effort she regained her equilibrium, coughed into one fist in an overly officious manner. When she looked up at him, her face was a trifle paler than usual, but other than that, the young woman had regained a measure of solid mental footing. Komamura Dano, allow me to offer my congratulations. If it is not too presumptuous, can I assume this was not a planned occurrence? He shrugged, face frustratingly unreadable. No. Irregardless of our. His eyes flickered about before finally settling on her again. Shared traits, I didn't even believe we could conceive a child together. That was putting it mildly. Having come to know the former captain a great deal better since he helped save her life the night Kyojaka was born, Rukia knew that his canine appearance hinted at a previous existence as a hollow, one which had not been completely cleansed upon entering Soul Society proper. This left Sijin in a state somewhat similar to a Vazard or Arankar, being both slightly hollow and plus at the same time. But still, could that explain this utterly unprecedented bombshell he just dropped on her? Unprecedented. Right. Not like a human ever got a death god pregnant or anything of the sort, know what I mean? That's... Actually, now that you mention it, I wonder what Renji has to say about this? Don't distract me. This is serious. I know what to do. Having finally divined some reason behind him seeking her out, Rukia felt a weight lift. The prospect of offering aid after being unable to help Yoshi made her feel lighter, as if slipping into the role that destiny meant for her. Koma Muradano, she spoke clearly, now feeling truly in control of herself. I understand exactly what you are going through. Please allow me to assist you in any way I can. What can I do to help? A measure of tension drained out of him as well, and he stood much more relaxed than before. I offer my thanks. I had hoped to speak to both you and Kurosaki Ichigo on this matter, as he no doubt holds insights which could be of specific value to me. If it would not be too much trouble, perhaps we might pay a visit to your home in the mortal realm. Here Rukia hesitated. She had planned to pay her respects at Yumishika's grave before going back to Heron Company and seeing about any paperwork that her reinstatement might require. But time enough for that later. This definitely took priority. Of course. She held up her hand, and the gate opened in an outpouring of blinding white light. Immediately a hell butterfly came bobbing out to guide them on their way. Sijin stepped aside with a gentlemanly bow, indicating he would follow in her wake. She accepted his kind offer, and moments later the halo was left even further deserted. No. No, this isn't right. This can't be happening. Poor Tison. Betrayed by those he trusted. Some things never change. Kaname Tison sat naked on the cold stone floor shaking and sweating. Charms encircled his wrists and neck, keeping him bound more securely than any chain. He was like a wild animal brought to bay. Tears poured down his face, though not a sound escaped his throat. They can't ask this of me. It's too much. I am not meant for this. Poor Tison. Poor blind Tison, to never see this coming. Do you not savor the irony as I do? It's just like that day, so long ago, when you betrayed your fellow officers, offering them up to Aizen's experiments. Now the pendulum has swung back, and it is your turn. Poor Tison. Poor blind Tison. From the eternal darkness around him came the sound of the witch's voice, muttering and droning foul curses. A sharp knife slashed his cheek, causing him to jerk away with a whimper. Then her hand caught his jaw with irresistible force and something was forced down his throat, drowning out any screams. Aizen-sama. Please. His silent cries were in vain. Lord Aizen had already explained the situation in painstaking fashion, like an artist describing his latest masterwork to the last detail. Tison had sat stunned as the plan was laid bare before him, as well as his part in it. He had offered only token resistance. After all, what was the point? When Aizen left him alone, Tison drew his sword and attempted to open his own throat with it. But the blade would not cut. Suzumushi cried softly in a corner of their soul as he pleaded with her to give him this last mercy. His hollow had only laughed at them, made strong in the knowledge that its time was fast approaching. The moment it had awaited for so long was finally upon them, a surprise to only one. The darkness that enclosed him from birth was creeping in. It surged through his blood, eating him from the inside out. Tison gasped as he felt a sudden sharp sensation in the center of his chest, and couldn't help himself. He screamed at the knowledge of what was about to happen. Does it hurt, Tison? Kaname nearly passed out from sheer panic when he felt his sternum start to pull inward, like a vacuum sucking his flesh and bone from the inside out. All the air was forced from his lungs, and he tried to breathe in for another scream, but failed. I know the feeling. Only thanks to you, it never stops for me, Tison. It never stops. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Forgive me, please. I can't. Too late, Tison. Poor blind Tison. Your reign is at an end. And mine begins. The hollow mask came pouring from his mouth as it had so many times before, only far more than usual, choking him on liquid white brutality. And it all overtook him then. Grief, for the woman he loved. Shame, for the friends he betrayed. Mistrust, for the allies he chose. Wrath, for everyone around him. And fear, for what they would do to him, if they only knew. His eyes rolled back in his head. A gurgling moan was the last sound Kaname Tissin ever made, before his chest split open, leaving an empty hole from front to back. His heart collapsed, and all reason went with it. Opening its masked jaws, the newborn hollow that had been a man only moments before uttered a blood-chilling screech. Anohana Retsu indicated for the servants to come forward. White-faced and shaking, they obeyed, lifting the creature onto a pallet and shuddering at the loathsome feel of its skin as their mistress busied herself putting away her implements and cleaning up the mess. Hurriedly they then carried the howling med thing from the Hollow Queen's lair. It still couldn't move, bound limp by the enchanted charms she had placed upon it. But even being near something this vile left them all certain of fresh nightmares. Nonetheless they knew their duty, and proceeded through the corridors of the palace in the middle of the night, taking the shortest route possible until at last they reached the domain of an even greater horror. Swallowing her fear, one of them knocked timidly upon the door frame. "Come in." The chamber they entered was bare of any adornments. No furniture, no carpeting, no paintings on the walls or even windows, just a bed with white silk sheets under a single spotlight. And sitting naked upon it, heedless of who might see her like this, was Tia Halibel. The Vastolord watched steadily as the servants ushered that howling med creature into her chambers. She pointed, and they deposited it on the bed next to her before fleeing as fast as deportment allowed. Once they were alone, all her attention fixed upon the drooling med hollow as it fought to assert itself in this new world that screamed back at its very presence. Behind masked jaws, Halibel's lips curved in a pleased smile. She observed her helpless victim, his previously brown skin now turned a lurid gray. Hands and feet were claws, ridged like broken rock. The serpent mask which in his vasored form still allowed the lower half of Tissin's face to be seen had its jaws open, but now they twisted and snapped insanely, no trace of a human being within their depths. It was a beautiful sight. Bending down, the hollow goddess traced her fingers slowly up that unresisting ashy torso, murmuring appreciatively as she came up to the hole in his chest, raw and throbbing with pain under her touch. The prey sobbed and snarled in impotent despair. Even were it not trapped by Anohana's spells, it stood no chance of resisting her. To prove this, Halibel ripped the bindings away. Immediately it sprang at her, sharp talons lashing out, biting in a frenzy. Its lunge drew up short as one slender hand shot out to wrap around the creature's throat. Those wicked claws slid over her smooth brown skin with no more effect than had she been made of rock herself. She let it struggle for a bit just to enjoy the show, then slammed it down onto the bed, pressing the side of its face against the mattress. Tissin's hollow remained pinned there, flailing ineffectually, ripping the sheets to shreds even as it failed to budge so much as a millimeter. At last the beast's strength gave out and it just lay there on its side, gasping and winded. "Good boy," Halibel crooned. She then bent down till her face hovered a bare inch from that heaving chest. Taking her sweet time, the voracious predator licked all around its hollow hole, feeling endless hunger thrash and roil inside of her with greater ferocity than anything this fallen soul could produce. Starvation was her natural state. She was long used to the pain this entailed. After all, it was the anticipation that kept her going. The meat remained sweet as ever, to be sure. But dreaming of feasting upon another soul made that eventual reality all the more mouth-watering, and added an unparalleled level of flavor to her meal when she finally sated herself. Tia Halibel longed to feast upon everyone around her, Aizen, Anohana, even Stark himself. There was little chance such a feast would ever come her way. But if it did, oh, how she would glut herself upon them. Such thoughts would have to wait. For now, there was the food right in front of her to concentrate on. And she had to be careful. "Don't worry," she panted. "I just need a taste." This was as much to convince herself as the hollow. Without further ado, before her urges could grow too clamorous, Halibel bit down into the edge of the hollow hole. It began to scream shrilly then, but she ignored this. Breathing raggedly through the sides of her mouth, she closed her jaws, feeling flesh give way like butter between her teeth. Blood gushed down her throat, so hot and strong she nearly lost control and swallowed the thing whole. Instead the cannibal spirit pulled back with slow, easy grace. She heard the tear of muscle and tendons ripping apart, sliding sweet over her lips while the meal brayed endlessly. At last Tia pulled away completely, trailing a long strip of flesh that dripped fresh blood down her breasts. Still pinning the hollow one-handed, Halibel groaned, closed her eyes, and swallowed. It was done. He had become a part of her body now. And once this was certain, she transformed into the Scylla. Her torso reared up huge and majestic, scales gleaming along her skin and bone spines sprouting sharp from her back. From the hips down nothing but a swarm of winding sharp-toothed eels and the heads of lionesses bit reflexively at anything that came near them. Halibel acted with all due haste. She picked up the struggling prey and inserted him into her own large hollow hole located in her abdomen. The void within her opened, another mouth seeking to be fed. Blood called to blood, stretching across dimensions. The hollow of Kaname Tisan emitted one last frantic wail before it sank into her bloodstream. As soon as she felt certain the transfer was underway, her form shifted back to that of a nominal human. Halibel collapsed onto the bed breathing raggedly. A wave of nausea and fever rose throughout her which she pushed back. Regurgitation would not be welcome at this stage. Nor could she run the risk of finishing the meal right away. Keeping her hunger in check was difficult while in resurrection, and impossible in Segunda Etapa. Only like this did she stand the slightest chance of holding off long enough for Tisan to complete his mission. He was on his way, traveling through the void of her bottomless hunger to come out the other side more or less whole. After about 10 minutes the goddess of starvation sat upright. She passed a trembling hand over her mouth, aching with the need to finish what she started. Halibel knew this feeling would not go away for a distressingly long time. All thanks to Aizen. So it fell to him to help her ignore those cravings. Thus Halibel rose and got dressed before going to report to her master. So that's the deal, Dad explained to them. The Kurosaka clan had gathered in their living room for this event. These two ghosts. He waved in the direction of an empty patch of air. Are going to give you a spiritual exam. It won't hurt, you shouldn't feel anything at all. Okay. We know the drill by now, Hirako noted, leaning back on the floor with legs splayed out in front of her. It's like Grandpa's physicals. When Kyojaku nudged her with an elbow, she threw him an irritable look. What? Sit Seiza, her older brother ordered. Why? They can see up your skirt. Now you're lying. Still, the thought of ghosts getting a peek at her panties caused the girl to hurriedly tuck her legs beneath her, leveling a warning frown in the direction she assumed their spiritual house guests were to be found. Good. Dad smiled. I'm proud of you. It felt nice to hear him say so. But a small mean part of Hirako's soul told her that comment was meant for Kyojaku alone. It made her want to get this over with and fast. They had been given health checkups before, but those were from Isane, Mom's boss in the afterlife. And she always came in a Jigai so that both children could see her. These new guys, whoever they were, didn't even have the courtesy to do that. They're probably but ugly and trying to hide it. Right, Kukaki? Her spiritual companion made no response. He had warned her about their being tailed earlier, but he didn't always talk to her. It figures. Looks like I'm on my own for the time being. Swell. Off to one side, their father conversed quietly with Khan and possibly the ghosts. The lanky track star appeared extremely uncomfortable, fidgeting from one foot to another with hands stuffed in his pockets. At one point she heard him say, "Are you sure Rukia is okay with this?" Dad just brushed him off, a sure sign the answer was no. After a while he came back to stand by them. Kyojaku, you're first. Yes, Tisan. Of course he's excited. He actually gets to see who's poking and prodding him. I have to sit here and wonder if they're groping me with ghost hands. Dad wouldn't let them, but I still don't like it. Moments later Kyojaku's head nodded forward in abrupt sleep, a sure sign of Shinigami magic afoot. Mom had explained to her some of the tools they used when dealing with mortals. Hirako wasn't sure if they were going to do the same to her or not. Suddenly this whole deal made her very uncomfortable. What were these invisible people up to? Well, if in doubt, there's always my trump card. The girl fingered the purloined soul candy dispenser in her pocket. She noticed Khan watching her with a frown and quickly left off, not wanting to give herself away. Taking a deep breath, Hirako waited until it was her turn. Small bits of conversation passed between Rukia and Saijin on their way back to Seoul society proper. Once there, a Senkaimon was readied quickly for her use, and soon enough they were following another butterfly through the void between worlds. At one point she noticed her traveling companion had stopped walking and turned to regard him. "Is everything alright, Koma Muradano?" The dog man peered about that otherworldly space, ears folded back slightly. "I thought I heard." After a while he left off and moved to rejoin her. "Please excuse my lapse. Let us continue." She looked at him uncertainly, but chose to respect his decision. They continued on. "Dreaming again. That's not so bad. So where should I go?" Kyojaku moved freely through the dreamscape in search of anything interesting. For a moment he remembered clearly that the Arashi mage was examining him in the living world while he dreamt. But just as fast that knowledge went away as his purpose refreshed. "Who's here now? Who's asleep like me? Can you hear my voice? Greetings, Prince Kukaki." All around him now stretched a field of beautiful flowers, with the shimmering golden sky dancing overhead. When he turned around, it was to find a regally dressed man sitting cross-legged at a small table. A teacup clinked on its dish, and that handsome figure turned friendly features on him, indicating with one graceful hand that he should take the chair opposite. Like they were old friends. Kyojaku stared. A light breeze rustled his hair. Hands clenched into fists involuntarily. Then he moved over the field to sit down across from his host. "Lord Takiyaku," he spoke with cool courtesy. "Would you like to hear a story?" Aizen Sosuke chuckled and took another sip of tea. He crossed one leg at the knee and leaned back on what was now a plush velvet couch, draping an arm over the backrest comfortably with head cocked to one side. His smile was positively devilish. "I would indeed." The Misho sorcerer passed a hand over the boy's sleeping brow, murmuring incantations. Glowing walls bedecked in strange symbols had sprung up around his sleeping son, and Ichigo found himself wondering if this was really such a hot idea after all. At the time Mishima suggested it there had seemed nothing more sensible. But right now the substitute Shinigami realized just how little he knew about Arashi magic. For all the ground he had made in studying Kido these past few years, he still counted himself a novice in terms of spell casting. Should have asked Nanao to attend as well. She'd know if anything was up for sure. You could always call this off. There is no shame in admitting when you have done wrong. Are you trying to tell me something, old man Zanjitsu? Even as he asked, a coil of uncertainty tightened in his stomach. The Zanpakuto spoke the truth. He had known from the start just how bad a plan this really was. For starters, he was doing it explicitly behind Rukia's back. But if you consider how overprotective she could be when it came to the kids, would anyone really blame him? At least Hirako appeared to be weathering the ordeal without concern. She didn't even seem aware the second Arashi mage had already begun an examination of her. There was no need to put her to sleep. Standing across from them, Khan turned a worried expression on Ichigo which he strove to ignore. At last the masked mage left off his spell casting. Rising up, he turned from Hirako back to her concerned father. "I can find nothing out of the ordinary with your daughter, good sir." For some reason that seemed odd. "Are you sure?" Ichigo pressed him. "What?" Hirako looked up uncertainly. "What's happening?" He held up a hand to let her know she should wait, during which time the Misho continued to explain. "The spell is designed to echo off any trace of soul power and return to me with that information. In this case, it came back clean. As you said, the girl does not have spiritual powers like her brother." Noticing his daughter still waiting for an answer, Ichigo informed her, "You're good, sweetie. They say there's nothing wrong with you." Hirako nodded slowly, seemingly not as relieved to hear this as he was. Then both of them turned their attention to the sleeping Kyojaku. One down. Maybe this wasn't such a bad idea after all? Even as he thought this, the first Arashi sorcerer said, "Something is happening." At that exact moment, a round shoji door appeared in the air off to one side. Foreheads all snapped around. Ichigo felt his heart grow cold as the doors slid open. Oh no! Not now! Rukia stepped out. She noticed Kon first and drew up in surprise. But when she caught sight of the two Arashi mages kneeling by their children, her eyes widened. How could you? Then everything went to hell. The hollow of Kaname Tissen tumbled down a tunnel that reeked of blood. It could do nothing but wail like a mad dog. And deep within, the man it had once been fought for his soul. They told me. Once I'm on the other side, assert control. I must do it. The witch said I would be able to. I must. He tried. But Kaname could gain no ground. He tasted only blood, heard only screams, saw nothing. All was lost. Lost. He would die alone here. Help me. Anyone. Aizen-sama. Saijin. Can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? Please. From out of the darkness, a voice answered. I hear you. Both Kaname and his hollow grew still. Fear surged through their souls. Oh. No. He. The Fenris snickered, as Shinigami and Hollow both screamed. No. No, get away from me. You can't have me. Not me. Intent upon delivering his story, Kyojaku suddenly paused. Did I just hear someone? It seemed he was not the only one. Aizen's attention too had drawn off to one side. The brightly lit garden around them was growing darker in that area. With regal slowness he rose to his feet. A bared sword appeared in his hand. Kyojaku? Get behind me, he ordered. The teen obeyed without question. He could feel something approaching them. Rising from the darkness below this makeshift dream. Whatever it was, it felt huge. Like a newborn volcano breaching the top of the ocean, causing it to bulge upwards. Without warning, the dream split. Saijin. Komamura was just about to follow Rukia through the exit when he heard a familiar voice scream his name. His head jerked up in surprise. Tissen. The dog giant spun about, peering frantically in every direction of this formless dimension. That wasn't his imagination. It was too clear. Uncertain what to do, he reached out a hand, perhaps hoping for someone to take hold. There was a sound of cloth flapping wildly in the wind. Then it tore, and all he heard was a terrible roaring laugh. Ah ha ha ha. Ifo found you. Only blackness greeted Kyojaku's eyes. What sounded like a cataract of water filled his mind, but for some reason he knew it was blood. Even as he realized this, the rising black boil burst. And what came out was insanity. Before it could reach him, though, Aizen dove forward. His head was crowned by a trio of skulls as the Lord of Nirvana launched himself at the massive mountain of madness. It screeched and giggled even as his blade tore into it. A huge orange eye loomed over all, swinging to fasten on Kyojaku. Ifo found you. He knew that voice. It had haunted him since he was a child. Panic took hold. Kyojaku tried to run, only to stumble and fall. Kurosaka-san. In desperation he looked up to see the familiar form of Saijin Komamura fighting against the flow of blood, striving with all his strength to reach him. Terrified, the boy held out a hand to him. Between the spirit and the living boy, something came howling to the surface. Like a drowning man it splashed and struggled, the hole in its torn chest weeping blood, a hollow mask of a snake snapping at empty air. But for just a moment, a human face peered blindly from within that horrid maw. Saijin! It wailed. Komamura abruptly reached for the thing as well. When he saw this, Kyojaku was gripped by fear that he might be forgotten and left behind. Please, don't let it get me. Don't let it get me. Not me. Not me. From far away, or deep below, something came winging towards them. Distant as a star, and just as small, it nonetheless crossed seemingly great distances. Kyojaku felt it sweep over him. For a moment he was assailed by a rank odor, an awful experience he could not remember ever encountering in dreams. The thing, whatever it was, flew right past him, and latched onto the drowning man. Tissen. Before anyone could speak, A maelstrom erupted in the Usagi Shoten. Hot wind rattled the windows and sent clothes flying on both humans and spirits. Lurid blue smoke swirled like hungry flames around Kyojaku. Ichigo staggered back, fumbling for the soul candy dispenser in his pocket. As he did, a shape took form within that conflagration. It resembled an antlered stag's skull, looming over his son with empty eye sockets blazing. Rage subsumed all else. The pill was in his mouth before he could think, and Ichigo Kurosaki emerged from his body with Zanjutsu already unfurled. He hoisted the great blade to strike that abomination down. Abruptly as it began, the storm died. The menacing figure vanished as well, leaving only a lingering scent of something unspeakably foul in the air. At the same time, he heard his daughter scream. "Get away!" Hirako couldn't make out what just happened. For a second both Dad and Kon gaped like they had seen a ghost, actually. Then a wind ruffled her hair from out of nowhere, and suddenly Dad looked almost insane with fury. She had to know what was going on. So without hesitation the girl slipped her soul candy dispenser out and popped a pill. It was the worst feeling in the world. Like vomiting, only with your whole body. All of a sudden, her flesh just rejected her. Next thing she knew, Hirako was floating above the ground to find herself staring at her mother, who was dressed as a Shinigami hovering just a few paces away. Rukia noticed her at the same time, but before either of them could speak, a creature in red and green wearing a demonic mask whipped around to face Hirako. The shock caused her to pull back from this ghastly figure with a horrified shout of, "Get away!" An arm suddenly reached past her, yanking the sword at Rukia's waist from its scabbard. An instant later it had transformed into a beauteous blade of purest white bedecked with a long samite ribbon. "First dance!" her own voice cried. "Tsukishiro!" The sword swung in a wide arc, and just like that, the demon was encased in a column of ice that tore straight through the ceiling. For a moment the disembodied girl could only stare entranced at this weird sight. Then she felt herself yanked roughly back, and before she knew it, Hirako was inside her body again. The pillar of ice remained, but nothing could be seen inside. For some reason, her hands felt bitterly cold. Hirako. Shaken, she looked over to find Kyojaku rubbing his eyes blearily. Her older brother peered at her in disbelief. "How are you holding mother's sword?" "What?" Hirako looked down at her empty hands, wondering what he meant. Meanwhile, their mother had stolen forward unseen to retrieve her soul cutter. At her command, the prison of ice vanished, freeing the Misho sorcerer before any permanent harm could be done to him. He collapsed, shivering heavily as his companion rushed over to perform medical treatment. Rukia could not spare them any of her concern. Right now she had too many pressing questions. "Tell me what just happened." "I have no idea, I swear. But when she held me, it felt..." "What?" "Like you were holding me. There's no other way to explain it. A full report would have to wait." She glanced quickly around the room. Ichigo had returned to his body and now stood anxiously a few paces off. Kon hung back looking scared and ashamed. The only good news was that the children seemed unharmed. Saijin Komamura hovered protectively over Kyojaku wearing a worried expression. "Rukia." That was Ichigo. Reaching a decision, Rukia sheathed her sword and declared in a cold voice that brooked no objections, "All of you get out." Kon obeyed quickly, moving to assist the Arashi in helping his injured counterpart out of the house. Komamura patted Kyojaku on the shoulder and murmured something to him before following in their wake. When they were gone, Rukia steeled herself, hands clenching into fists. Closing her eyes and drawing a deep breath, she finally looked at Ichigo. To his surprise, the small Shinigami appeared more sad than angry. "Well?" Rukia asked softly. "What do you have to say to me?" And he dropped to the floor before her. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure the kids were all right." Miserably Ichigo lifted his head. "Please try to understand, Rukia. I was worried." Her breath came out in a sigh. Violet eyes closed as tears traced parallel paths down both cheeks. "Tell me." She swallowed, almost choking on the hurt. "Everything." Deep beneath the lifeless soil of Hueco Mundo, in a cavern hewn from bare rock, a pool of blood lingered. One of several left in reserve by the Espada Tia Halibel, this forbidding morass served as a means of communication across the void. And sometimes even more. Without warning, those deceptively placid depths began to froth and boil. The huge skull of a lion emerged from it long enough to belch out a great glob of blood onto the floor before sinking back out of sight. The regurgitated lump began to squirm. Like a fish out of dry land, it flailed almost in a panic before abruptly dissolving into a rush of red dust. From within that deathly mass, a new form stood slowly upright. Brushing itself off, the traveler began to walk across the floor of the cavern. No torches or light of any kind existed here, but still its steps led it unerringly to a small tunnel, which it followed on a long winding journey until finally emerging from a small cluster of rock poking out of the dunes. There it took a deep breath of dry desert air. The hollow that had once been Kaname Tisan had undergone a drastic change since being forcibly expelled from Nirvana. Now a thick fur cape fell from his shoulders to hang just above his clawed feet. Bare-chested, he wore only a wrap of cloth around his waist that reached down to the knees. The sword Suzumushi hung from his hip, its sheath now made of animal hide. He gripped the handle securely with cracked, diseased claws. Long black braids still spilled over his shoulders, but the rest of the hollow's head was mostly hidden by a strangely wrought helmet that resembled a stag's skull with the flared hood of a cobra. His real eyes opened on the back, peering around in search of anything that might pose a threat. As for the face, only his mouth was visible beneath the horned helm. Great antlers emerged from his scalp and reached up to jab at the sky in a cluster of tines, the wind almost seeming to whistle as it passed through them. The eye sockets were as empty as the hollow hole in his chest, marred by a terrible wound on one side that no amount of regeneration could ever heal. He picked at it irritably, cursing the Espada bitch who had maimed him what seemed a lifetime ago. Their plan had succeeded. But this new transformation, was it the result of becoming fully hollow? Was he even still himself? Who am I? The answer came to him unbidden, like a whisper from within his soul. Kaname Cernunnos. Yes, yes, that is who I am now. Excellent. And lifting his head, the hunt master let out an awesome howl. Kaname waited then, confident. He knew without understanding rightly how that his call would be answered. And sure enough, within the hour, huge shapes began to appear on the horizon. As they approached, they were revealed to be Minos Grande all. This herd of mindless soul masses clustered around their old master's promontory. He inspected them. Only a few at first. But in time, there would be more. And as his first act, he ordered the horde to bow to him. They did so without fail. Satisfied, the new master of the hunt set off across Hueco Mundo with his pack in tow. Shirabe awoke with a start. The old woman found herself in an unfamiliar room and almost panicked. Thankfully her failing memory managed to recollect that this was Master Kirako's residence. At her dear boy's insistence, she had returned once again to the site of her greatest shame, to spend her remaining days in undeserved comfort. The very thought of it made her poor heart ache, and she began to sob quietly against the pillow. Granny. Surprised, the weakened spirit looked over as a candle was lit. When she saw who held it, a smile of unsurpassed joy broke her wrinkled, tear-stained cheeks. Momo-chan. To be continued. Check the description for the links to the author.